Are we recording and live streaming, or do I need to wait?
We're recording. Carson City, please inform when we're live streaming.
We are live streaming right now.
Thank you, Sean.
Excellent. All righty. Once again, good morning and welcome to the Nevada Commission on School Funding on Friday, April 17th. And Jessica, will you please call roll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Member Casey?
Present.
Member Fueling?
Present.
Member Gowdy?
Here.
Vice Chair Hobbs?
Here.
Member Jensen?
Here.
Member Johnson? Member Mathers?
Here.
Member Mathers excused. Chair McCormick Lee?
Here.
Member McIntosh?
Here.
Member Morris Hibbler will be joining late. Madam Chair, you have a quorum. Excellent. Thank you very much. Once again, I'm going to kind of go through the housekeeping rules, especially for the video streaming. I want to welcome any of the folks in the audience who are joining us by streaming. And even in our virtual sessions, we want to make sure we keep some of the housekeeping rules. The next piece is actually specifically for those who are watching it live streaming, that due to the due to the circumstances created by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Commission on School Funding is meeting by video conference. In accordance with Governor Sisolak's State of Emergency Directive 006, Section 1, there is no physical location designated for this meeting. The meeting is, however, being live streamed from the Nevada Department of Education's website. We will be taking public comment regarding agenda items in just a few moments, and we'll take non-agenda items, public comments at the end of the meeting. Members of the public, while you are not able to stand up in a physical location, you are able to provide public comment in writing via email. Public comment will be accepted via email for the duration of the meeting and shared with the Commission on School Funding during the appropriate agenda items. Public comment may be emailed to Jessica Tudman, and that email address is actually at the top of today's agenda, as well as posted on the Nevada Department of Education website. Members of the public are asked to indicate in the email subject the line, in the subject line, whether the comment is for public comment number 1 or public comment number 2. And I do want to note that we will read those items into the agenda. And please know that we are accepting emails throughout the meeting. For commission members, please, once again, and as always, remember to silence all electronic devices when you're not speaking. Please mute your microphone because we'll hear background. I will try to remember to do so as well. If you wish to speak, I think it worked pretty well yesterday. Just kind of give me a nod. I'm watching carefully, and Jessica is also watching carefully. And unmute your microphone and then remute when you are done with your comments. Also, always remember that we are video streaming live. So as you are on the screen, keep in mind that it is a video stream. Finally, for presentations, again, much like we did yesterday, please hold all questions until after the presentation, and that at that time we'll take the questions from the commission members. And thank you very much. I think the next piece of this is to actually move into public comment number 1. I'll just make a brief statement again. I just want to say, given the circumstances around the country and in the state of Nevada, I would just want to say how good it is to see you and see all of us healthy and still committed to this work. I know Lisa is not here. It's because she's the commander for COVID, handing out materials, etc., for in Las Vegas, in the county and in the city. And then also I know that Poonam is not here because she is similarly engaged in activities related to the pandemic. So our thoughts were with them as they do that work. Lisa indicated she'd be able to get here a little bit late. With that, let's go ahead and Jessica, would you please share the public comment number 1?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This morning, at this moment, we have received 9 emails that echo the over 170 emails we received yesterday, and I want to enter them into the record again today as we received more after yesterday's meeting. Dear Senator Mo Dennis and Senator Joyce Woodhouse, I write to ask you to delay the implementation of the new funding formula as the plan has become even more unworkable. With the governor's request that agencies begin to review their budgets for areas to cut, we are afraid that the economic impacts of this crisis will be devastating and long-lasting. Your job is to use the current year's budget to make recommendations. However, with our new economic realities, we believe it would be irresponsible to make recommendations based on those numbers. The only responsible action the Commission can take is to document these current economic conditions and recommend to indefinitely delay the July 1st, 2021 implementation. Thank you. And again, Madam Chair, that is the only public comment that we've received so far this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. In that case, I think we are ready to move into, unless anybody has comments about public comment, let's go ahead and move into agenda item number 3. Just a reminder to mute anything, and if you have multiple speakers going, we'll get an echo. Recommendations regarding weights for categories of pupils identified in Senate Bill 543. And I believe that presentation is by Heidi Hartz.
So good morning, members of the Commission. For the record, I'm Heidi Hartz, and I serve as the Deputy Superintendent for Business and Support Services at the Department of Education. We have a presentation for you today reflecting on the conversations and recommendations that have been brought forward to the Commission on School Funding regarding the weights for specific categories of pupils that are identified in Senate Bill 543. And we hope that with the conclusion of this presentation, you'll be able to provide the department and our collaborators with more direction on where you would like to see the weights set as the model is stood up for the first time. Next slide. As a reminder, Senate Bill 543 requires that weights be established for each category of pupils identified in the bill, that the weights are expressed as a multiplier, which will be applied to the statewide base per pupil funding amount. As a reminder, the statewide base per pupil funding amount is the amount that we have included in the pupil-centered funding plan before any of the adjustments or cost factors have been applied. As a reminder, pupils who belong to more than one category identified in the bill would receive only the weighted funding for the category that has the highest weight. That is a requirement specific to this piece of legislation. And lastly, we would remind you that the multiplier for a fiscal year is intended to be equal to or greater than the prior fiscal year's multiplier, unless the state education fund either increases or decreases. And Senate Bill 543 outlines provisions that address both of those situations. The Commission has done a great deal of work when it comes to reviewing and considering the weights for the 4 identified pupil groups identified in Senate Bill 543. This slide is just some of the highlights of the activities and the presentations that have occurred. I would also note that during the February meeting, the Commission also held a public workshop during which community members had the opportunity to provide input regarding the weights that were being considered by the Commission. This slide represents or summarizes the options that have been presented to the Commission on School Funding with respect to weights for students who have been designated as gifted and talented. You may recall that Back in November, APA provided a summary of work that they had done previously for the Department of Education, in which they identified what weights could look like based on different scenarios within the state of Nevada. At that time, the recommendation that they had put forward and continue to support is a multiplier of 0.05. Currently, under the Nevada plan, and just looking at the budget for the Department of Education, funding for gifted and talented is divided amongst all eligible students. Using our fiscal year 20 budget, the multiplier is currently 0.14. And then in the blueprint that was presented to the Commission on School Funding by Applied Analysis in February, when we took the Department of Education budget and each county school district budget and looked at what was budgeted to be expended on gifted and talented students in the current fiscal year, that multiplier at that time calculated to be 0.36. I do want to acknowledge and clarify that we continue to work on the data that's included in the blueprint on a daily basis. And so while we believe that that 0.36 weight is relatively accurate, it may not be absolutely accurate as we continue to work with school districts to better understand their budgets and the nuances that each county has when they develop their school district budget. So in looking at the various weights that have been discussed at this point in time, the recommendation for the Commission's consideration is to recommend a multiplier that maintains the level of funding that is currently in place in fiscal year 20, which would be 0.14 if you choose to go with what is available just using the Department of Education's budget. Or you could choose to go with something that is closer to what is reflected in the blueprint. We would note that when you compare what the weights are currently either in the Nevada plan or in the blueprint, they are higher than what APA recommended when they did their independent work back in 2018. Another option for the Commission would be to reduce the multiplier less than it is currently, either to something that equates to the APA recommendation or something in between those numbers. Do you want me to go through the entire presentation, Madam Chair, or do you want to pause for discussion after each category of student?
Actually, I'm leaning toward after each category, but your thoughts, Heidi?
That's fine with me.
Okay. Would it be best, though, to take gifted and talented with special education, or no reason to do so?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I would prefer to do each group individually.
You got it. Okay. Anybody else have a question? I just have one that I think is relatively simple. It's a procedural question. My question, okay, Jason, I'll go with mine and then actually, Jason, go ahead. Member Gowdy.
So I want to get some clarification because, we did note that in the law, the weights have to be at least equal to or greater than the prior year, which I think is 2020. So by definition, if we utilize what we believe is the appropriate weights under the APA guidelines, which was, the experts went out and did a lot of work and came back that it should be 0.05. I just want clarity that if we utilize the 0.05 as that's the target weight, and then we put it into operation, we still can't go below what the base year was. So it's going to be whatever that is. And then I would guess, I think there's a mechanism that over time as funds change and increase, essentially that weight could be slowly eroded down to whatever the amount is. And I guess I'd look at maybe Jeremy and obviously Heidi to kind of clarify how that would work over time.
So for the record, Heidi Hartz, we put in option 2 of reducing the weight as it is now. If the commission chose to go forward with that, that could certainly be something that could be expanded upon in recommendations to the governor and the legislature in your July 15th communication. I think that the bill is somewhat ambiguous in how we set the first round of weights. Because I believe the language could be interpreted either way. Either what we have in fiscal year 20 is the baseline from which we must move forward, or the fact that the multipliers need to be equal to or increasing from one year to the next would begin in fiscal year 22 when the pupil-centered funding plan is implemented.
Heidi, this is probably a similar kind of question. So I want to clarify what I think are our 3 considerations on the table, at least. A multiplier from the original conversations of 0.05, a multiplier based on state Nevada plan funding, available funds at 0.14, or the combination of state and local funds, school district funds, at a multiplier of 0.36. So just number 1, that's what I'm looking at, correct?
For the record, Heidi Hartz, those are the 3 multipliers that have been identified at this point in time.
Right. So then I guess my other question is, if, and this might be a philosophical one, I'm just saying out loud. So if we chose to go with the 0.36, are we thinking that that is going to drive decisions down the line, that our base weight, our starting weight, will always be the combination of the state funds and the currently allocated school district funds? In which case, maybe that's another piece of what we need to think about, is not just is it a 0.36 the right number, but do we agree with the idea of it is state funds and the school district allocations to date that make up that starting point? Or do we really want to look at the state funds as being the starting point? Or do we want to look at recommendations based on essentially research or the work that was done earlier by APA, the relative weights? So for me, I think it's also thinking about that in a conceptual way. So if I make a decision here to go with choice B, then am I sort of mentally making the statement in my head along the way? So Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Paul Johnson for the record. I have a problem picking any one weight in any one of the categories because funding's linked for all of the categories. I would actually like to see, I wouldn't mind seeing these 3 options plugged into the formula so that we could see the interplay between all of the different sources of funds. This is going to affect whatever we put into, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but whatever we put in as a weight for gifted and talented, for example, is going to affect the amount of money that's available in each one of the other pots of funding. And picking a weight right now without understanding the impact, I'm not completely comfortable doing that with any of the categories. But I do like being able to plug in each one of these options to see how that affects the interplay of funding between base and weights.
Amanda?
Thanks. I just wanted to give a little context for the weight that we had recommended in the prior study. This is one that we didn't have information coming out, a lot of information coming out of the professional judgment or the evidence-based, the adequacy approaches that we had used. So we were primarily looking at what were other states doing. And most states are doing very little in the area of gifted. The highest weight that we saw, I think, was about 0.35. So really kind of in line with that highest weight that you're looking at. So I think this is one area where as APA, we feel more comfortable with movement away from the recommendation versus the others that had a larger body of work to support them. And then I just want to throw out one thing for kind of consideration is to also kind of philosophically maybe keep this weight in mind with, as you're thinking about the weights in other areas, does it make sense that you'd only have a 0.25 weight for at-risk and then a 0.35 for gifted when you're both trying to provide the same extra supports and services to the groups? So maybe also not thinking about them in isolation a little bit. So that was just some context that might be helpful for the group.
Guy, go ahead. Guy Hobbs, Member Hobbs.
Oh, thank you. Since I think we would probably have the same conversation with respect to each of the weights, the point that Jason raised about what the direction was in Senate Bill 543, I think we need to explore that because I think that sets the baseline for us. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I lost the screen here. I think that sets the baseline going forward, and I think we need to understand what our latitude is here because I remember reading, and maybe Jeremy can insert a couple of thoughts here, that the legislature's intent was that the amount set for each of these was essentially equal to or greater than the prior year, or roughly equal to the prior year. Jeremy, can you clarify that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I want to make sure that we're all kind of saying the same thing because there are different weights that are for purposes of consideration. Within Senate Bill 543, there is language both for the base and for the weights that essentially says that it's the intent of the legislature that the values used for those are no less than what they were in the prior year. And for purposes of our conversation here, at least for purposes of standing up the blueprint, we're using 2020 as the prior year. Because revenues can only be weights or base for purposes of this allocation, I think what Member Hobbs was just alluding to is that under Section 4.1, it essentially says that the base must be no less than the base from the prior year. And as Ms. Hartz indicated previously, the weights must also be no less than they were from the prior year. So relative to standing up the model itself, again, I may be missing something here, but there is no sort of discretion relative to that. That is the value of the base as it currently exists in 2020. That is the value of the weights as it exists in 2020, such that the amount of money that was going to the base would be allocated to all students, and such that the amount of money that was going to each cohort of students under the weights would continue to go to each cohort of those students. That becomes the initial starting point for the allocation. Now, there's a second question relative to the weights, and that is the aspirational weights. What happens when there is more money that comes in to the funding plan? Senate Bill 543 and the pupil-centered funding plan does not distinguish between state revenue and local revenue. It is all the same revenue that is within the Nevada Education Fund. And so because of that, right, we're talking about all of these funds being distributed. If there is more money that comes in, the way that Section 4 works is essentially the base must be increased by not less than inflation plus enrollment, and then any additional funds are to be allocated to each of the weighted categories based in a proportion determined by the commission. Now that set of weights, the aspirational weights that at least as we have stood up right now in the blueprint, as those provided by APA, and I would think are at the discretion of the commission relative to whether they should be higher or whether they should be lower. But in terms of the weights that are the initial starting point, because the provisions of SB 543 require that both the base be equivalent to the base of the prior year and the weights be equivalent to the weights of the prior year, right? Those are mathematically determined, not subjectively determined.
So,
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, just to follow up with Jeremy there. I think you answered in the last part. I thought it was more of a mathematical determination to start out with than it was a matter of choosing a value. Just making the determination about what the weights were in the prior years and applying those until and unless we get to the point of being able to change those weights because we have the funding to do so. Is that accurate? Yes, sir.
So clarification then on my part and double checking. Mark, Member Mathers, did you want to make a statement? I couldn't tell. I thought maybe. Okay. And Dave, so let me ask one clarifying question, then I'll go to Member Jensen. However, and I think we had this discussion in the February, the definition of the current weight, and I think that's what I see on the slide, is the definition of the current weight, which cannot be reduced in the future, the definition of the amount of dollars allocated by by the state to districts, or is it, which I suspect the third option is, I think the 0.36 is developed out of the dollars that are allocated by the state plus the dollars that districts have chosen to allocate from their budgets toward that effort. Because we saw that impact in special education. So definition of the starting weight has to be decided. And that is where we need to make a decision, I think. So Heidi, I don't know if that's to you, if that's to Jeremy, but I just want to understand that part of our decision is, are we indicating that it is state dollars toward this component, or are we indicating that it is state dollars plus what a district has chosen to allocate from their budgets? And then my only other comment is kind of, Paul, I guess I'm struggling with, I already know what I'll learn if I run this through the blueprint 3 different ways. I'm going to see if I use APAs, that there's more in the base and for other areas. If I use the 0.14, there'll be a little less in the base. And if I use a 0.36, there'll be even less in the base or for the weights. So, and I also know that the percentage of the student population that are gifted and talented is smaller than those that are L's or that are at risk or that are special ed. So the impact of those adjustments will actually be smaller. So I guess I'm not sure that I gain a lot from seeing that it changed by, I'm going to make up silly numbers, that it changed by $10 versus $5 versus $2. I know that given our current situation, that's what happens. So I'm not sure I gain a lot personally. Not that everybody would agree with me, but I just think that, yeah, I get what's going to happen. So, Dave, Member Jensen.
Thank you, Chairwoman McCormick-Lee. I think you started to articulate really what I was going to bring up, and I don't know if it's so much of a question, but I think it's an inherent concern as we identified that 0.36 has a lot to do with the choice of school districts. And the choice that Washoe, Clark, White Pine, Humboldt make is different. And that also means that our choices to apply district funds may change next year as our numbers change, as the needs change, as our revenue streams change. As a result, I see an inherent danger going with that NDE plus school district, where the NDE Nevada plan at the 0.14, as it ties to the law, seems to be where we really need to be having this conversation.
I always love it when you forget to click on the mute. Any other? Member Gowdy. Jason.
Thanks. And I think that we had clarity on this before, but I'm not sure because we've talked about many different things. Going back to Jeremy's point about, the base, and one is, I think that we need clarity from whoever's going to give us clarity on what the base year is. That's important. if there's ambiguity in this law about whether it's 2022 or 2020, that needs to be decided now, because these decisions need to be based off of real information. So I think that whatever that decision needs to be clarified. But then to Jeremy, I want to get clarity on when we say that the values established in the base year, and let's just use 2020 so we can talk about something, the values that are established there are the baseline, and it becomes a mathematical equation. Are we talking about the actual dollar values as attributed to GATE, and we'll use GATE as an example, or are we talking about the weight itself? Because if we're talking about dollar values, we can use the APA weight, and that dollar value never goes up, and essentially the effective weight goes down. And I can't remember, I know I probably asked, but I know that we've also changed kind of a bunch of information. So can you help clarify what that is, please?
Sure, I'll try and answer both questions to the best of my ability. The way that Section 4 reads is that the immediately preceding year establishes that value. And so we are rapidly getting to FY 2021. The first year of full implementation will be 2022. While we are holding everything up based on FY 2020, it will probably be FY 2021 that ultimately becomes instructive for that. With regard to the second part of your question, Section 4, subsection 5A specifically says that the multiplier for each category of pupils for any fiscal year may not be less than the multiplier from the immediately preceding fiscal year unless, and then those unlesses are essentially unless revenues go down, is essentially what that says. I believe Ms. Hartz clarified this on the record back in February, as the chair indicated, and I think it's absolutely correct. That means the multiplier, not the absolute value associated with that.
Mark, Member Mathers?
Yeah, Mark Mathers for the record. So I thought Dr. McCormick-Lee, you framed this perfectly. We need to definitionally determine kind of which, do we include just state funding or local funding in terms of the current weights? And I totally agree with Dr. Jensen. It has to be just the state funding. What districts have chosen to use from base dollars to apply to GT or at risk or what have you, those were local decisions made with base dollars, general fund, unrestricted dollars, which is base. So I agree, Dr. McCormick-Lee, with your thought that we need to probably be very consistent in our definitions here. And I agree with Dr. Jensen that it should only include state funding if we go down that road, or the APA recommendation for the aspirational weight. It should not include any local funding that districts have chosen to use from base dollars to supplement state restricted funding.
And I hear Jeremy whispering in my ear to be careful, and whether or not it's right or not, but he's not really whispering in my ear. But mentally, I'm hearing someone whisper, careful using the word local dollars, because local dollars and state dollars are combined to create the the base. It's actually district allocations, right? And I know that's what you're saying, Mark. But I just want to make sure, because like I said, I have this little mental person whispering in my ear, careful, don't use the word local dollars. So I just want to make sure I'm getting it right. So thanks for actually confirming that I get this. So that's nice.
Well, and I if with your indulgence, I think Heidi noted, this is a transition. We're going from the Nevada plan to the new pupil-centered funding plan. And so I'm saying under the Nevada plan, the local, I'm referring to local dollars as they exist under the current Nevada plan. But I agree that how districts have chosen to use base dollars to supplement state funding for these weights should not be factored in definitionally to the determination of weights.
So do I hear a potential motion there to potentially go with option 2? Or are we not quite ready yet?
I'd be comfortable with that.
Okay, you want to go for it? Make a motion or?
Sure, I would. Sorry, I'm trying to get it up on my screen. I would move to adopt or move to approve option 2 to reduce the multiplier to the APA recommendation of 0.05.
Okay. So that wasn't the motion I expected, but that's good. We'll take that as a start. That's okay. Good.
No, do you want a more general recommendation about the definition?
No, that's fine. Let's do that one because we can either get a second or talk a little bit about it and I'll explain what I was thinking. So do we have a second for that? Yeah, I actually thought, well, since we don't have a second, what I actually thought you were going to say is, and it's very tiny on the screen, I actually thought you were going to make a motion to adopt the Nevada, from the Nevada plan, which would be the 014, which is what I thought you were going to say based on the conversation, but that's okay.
I'm actually okay with doing that.
Okay. Do you want to restate the motion then?
I mean, this one's kind of unique in that this is the only weight that's going down.
Right.
So, you know what? I'm going to pass and let someone else make the motion. Let me do that.
Okay. Okay.
Madam Chair.
Not having a second, then we're going to move on to either further discussion or a different motion. Thanks, Mark.
Madam Chair, I would make a motion that we adopt the multiplier of 0.14 for gifted and talented.
Okay. Do I have a second?
I'll second that. This is Jim McIntosh for the record.
Okay. All righty. Jess, is there any further discussion? Anybody want to have a further discussion? Okay. And Jason, Member Gowdy?
I just wanted to go back because I think this is what Jeremy and Guy said, that the 0.14 is the mathematically derived number using the base, and that's basically what we should be using anyway. Is that correct? Make sure I interpret that.
I hesitate because that sounds like a vote in there, but that's...
No, sorry, I was more clarifying. So we've had the first, the second, so now this is a clarifying question to Mr. Aguero. Just kind of clarifying the conversation between he and Mr. Hobbs.
I guess I have a clarifying question myself. It seems to me that the commission is having a conversation in terms of whether state funds are included or excluded from the calculation of the multiplier in the base year. Whether historically identified local funds are included or excluded in that. Okay, Jason, if I'm asking the wrong question, the problem is that if the multiplier is mathematically determined by whatever the ultimate base value is, you and I've had that conversation before, right? So that's what it is. So as we make adjustments to things, that will also result in an adjustment to this multiplier. That's just eventually what will happen, because the ultimate exercise is that the value has to equal whatever it was in the prior year. So if you go in and you arbitrarily set it at 0.14 or 0.24 or 1.24, essentially that multiplier may be different than what it was in the prior year. If it is, then you will essentially violate section 4.1 in Senate Bill 543, because the base would end up being lower because you've increased that amount. Alternatively, if you set it too low, you will have violated section 5, subsection 5 of section 4, because you would have set it too low and you'd be doing that. At the end of the day, the section 4 is constructed such that you cannot fund any weighted funding any less or any more than it was in years prior. You are attempting to set a weight that is mathematically determined by the legislation. So I honestly, I don't know how to provide you any more clarification around that.
So kind of a follow-up, I guess, and I want to kind of get back to what our chair and others were talking about. So I want to make a distinction between how the funding gets to the district and how the district then spends the money. I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about the effective weight of GATE being either 0.36 or 0.14. So the state, they have a base, and then they fund at, it looks like 0.14 to the districts in totality throughout the state on average. That's what I'm reading out of there for the year that was calculated. And then the the districts then get their funding, and they then supplement that 0.14 with 0.22 to get up to the 0.36 spend. So my point is, I think what we're trying to clarify is that the weights should only be calculated based off the amount of money allocated to the districts in totality from the state as a percentage of the base, not calculated based on how the districts spend the total money and how much they actually spend on the GATE program. So it's not state versus local, it's how the state funds the districts versus how the districts fund the schools. I think that's a distinction. We should be focusing, at least in this first component, at least in my view, on how the state gives the districts money. We haven't quite got to all the intricacies of how then the districts can spend and how much flexibility. I know there's some built in there, Jeremy, so we appreciate that. But that's the piece I want to make that distinction. And that's why I kind of shook my head is that, the state and local, I think everybody is just kind of using those interchangeably because of history. But it's merely, in my view, how it gets there. And so with your comment then, Jeremy, I completely agree that the percent weight of whatever we set right now becomes somewhat irrelevant until we actually go through the exercise of establishing a base and running it through the program to see what it is in the base year. So again, I guess I would look at legal counsel or look to legal counsel to say, can we do a motion that essentially does not define a number, but essentially just sets it at law at whatever the base year is calculated?
Do we need to define, to your point, Jason, but do we need to make the distinction that set to whatever is calculated in the base year dependent on those dollars that are coming from the state, not that have been chosen by a district to allocate to schools? I'm seeing a lot of nods. So I think we're looking for legal, and Heidi Hartz, if you could have can you confirm what we're talking about or jump in on that?
So Heidi Hartz for the record. First, I just want to clarify that in Senate Bill 543 in Section 81, which establishes when the different sections of the bill become effective, Section 4, which is where the weights are established, became effective upon passage and approval for the purposes of creating the executive budget for the upcoming biennium. But with respect to implementation, it would not be effective until July 1st, 2021. The department believes that the weights that are being set today would be the weights that would go into effect in fiscal year 2022, which would be the first year that the pupil-centered funding plan is currently scheduled to be implemented. I would also note that the department appreciates the fact that school districts budgeted money amongst the various categories of students based on the needs of their school districts, and that is different for each school district. That being said, when we move to the pupil-centered funding plan, many of the state and local revenues will be commingled within the state education fund, where all revenues will be collected. So just a cautionary point, if the commission chooses, for example, to say beginning in fiscal year 22, the weight for gifted and talented will be 0.14, that means that the funding that's available for gifted and talented services could ultimately be reduced within a school district or many school districts because those local funds are no longer reflected in that weight.
So would Member Gowdy, could you kind of restate the way you said that there at the end? That was indicating that it would be a function of rather than a number. And Heidi, what I'm looking for is for you to say, so is that sufficient to give guidance? And is there a way to indicate what that number is? That number as of today 0.14, or where are we on that? So 2 pieces. Member Gowdy, if you could just restate it, and then Heidi, if you could kind of indicate if that's sufficient for you to move forward.
Yeah, Jason Gowdy for the record. So I think and again, this is phrased as a question, not as a true motion, but would we be able to make a motion that is a little bit more general, instead of using a percentage, to say something that we approve the weight for gifted and talented at the calculated weight for the base year under the AB 543, and just leave it at that versus defining a number?
Heidi Hartz for the record. Madam Chair, I believe that the commission can craft the motions however they feel comfortable. If the motion evolves to be the recommendation that it's the calculation off of the base year, we would the department would request that the base year being stated in the motion so that there's absolute clarity with the commission's intent.
And Heidi, to ensure we do that, your indication for that base year is that is fiscal year 20?
Heidi Hartz for the record. From a state budget building perspective, we must use fiscal year 20 as our base budget year. However, the commission can choose, for example, to use fiscal year 21 as the base budget year, or something different.
Okay. Member Mathers, Mark?
So I think because we kind of started off with GT, and GT is kind of funky, what we need to vote on for other weights is the target weight, not the starting point. I mean, I think it's important to define what the starting point is, and I would make a motion to define the starting point as being the amount allocated by the state, in this case 0.14, but what the commission needs to vote on, if we looked at special ed, is what is the target weight we want to vote on. I think it's been said, the starting point, once we define it, is just set. I think that's what Jason's saying. There's no need to vote on the starting point, but we do need to vote on the aspirational target weight. And like I say, for GT, it's kind of screwy because the target weight, at least recommended by APA, was less than the starting point. The target weight's less than the starting point. But ultimately, for each of these, we have to vote on the target weight that we will get to. And then ultimately, I think the commission needs to advise on how do we get from the starting point to the target weight. Is it proportional for all weights, or what's that mechanism? So I just wanted to make that clarification. Like I say, for GT, it's kind of funky. But I mean, to me, we start with the starting weight of 0.14, which is based on the state allocations, and then we can set our target weight at 0.14.
Okay, we've got a comment from Jim McIntosh, Member McIntosh, and Member Casey, Dusty Casey.
I'm sorry, thank you. For the record, Jim McIntosh. I agree with what I understand what Member Mathers is saying, and I think that's what's made this difficult, is that And I just want to make sure I'm thinking about this correctly. I just pulled up Clark's budget very quickly, the tentative budget. Clark's receiving approximately $9 million in gate funding, and we're just wanting to ensure that's the amount that the state's providing to you. You want to ensure you're not going to get any less than that $9 million in terms of setting this weight. We want to set an aspirational weight. The aspirational weight, though, recommended is lower and may not result in the $9 million that coming to Clark in the terms of the actual revenue you've been receiving in the past. Am I correct in understanding? Because I agree with the 0.14 weight being, this is how much is being provided. I would assume based off the per pupil amounts that we're seeing as the base that Clark would continue to receive that $9 million. It's just kind of how I'm approaching it. And so am I correct in that's because that's how I'm looking at this also, is you would at a minimum say, we want to receive what we're receiving in the past. That's what makes gate, like you say, Mark, a little bit difficult because the aspirational weight is much lower and you wouldn't actually receive that amount. I am understanding this, right? Okay, thank you.
Member Casey, then Member Morris-Hippler. So Member Casey.
Thank you, Member Casey, for the record. I'm struggling with the notion that we're trying to establish weights before we've established the base. So in other words, have we made an assumption about the base already? Are we just saying that the base is what the base is in, let's say, fiscal year 20, and then we're moving forward with the weights? Because as we go down through this process, looking at the waterfall, if we decide that the base needs more funding, then the aspirational weights could change based on the base funding. So I guess my first question is, have we already made an assumption on base funding? And if not, then how do we proceed? I understand with the weights that we have to match the funding that we're currently getting. Let's just call it fiscal year 20 or whatever. But at the end of the day, depending on what we determine the base to be, can change, the weights could ultimately change because of that, or am I missing something? And I'll be honest, I don't know who that question is for.
Heidi, do you want to take that question?
Sure. For the record, Heidi Hartz. So while we can identify all of the revenue that would theoretically be in the state education fund, as if the pupil-centered funding plan were in place, and we can begin to work towards what the statewide base per pupil amount would be. We are in that phase now, working with applied analysis to get that final number. Then based on the recommendations of the commission from yesterday, we now have information that would allow us to go forward in building out the model that takes into consideration the calculations that allow us to go from the statewide base per pupil amount to the adjusted base per pupil amount for each school district. So what we're trying to do today is to establish what the multiplier should be for these 4 targeted groups. The multiplier that's set, for example, for gifted and talented, would be applied towards the statewide base per pupil amount, and then those funds would follow the student to their school and would be in addition to whatever amount of the adjusted base per pupil funding went to those schools based on the school district's decisions. So I think it's important to remember that school districts, when they receive their allocation for the adjusted base per pupil amount appropriate to their school district, they then decide how those funds are dispersed out to each individual school. But when it comes to weighted funding under Senate Bill 543, the funding is intended to follow the child to the school where they are, to provide whatever services they're eligible for that fall within these 4 categories of students. Remember that students who fall within more than one category only get the highest weight for the categories that they belong to. And I want to acknowledge, I understand these are difficult decisions to make because we are constantly faced with which comes first, the chicken or the egg. And we haven't found that answer. So what we're trying to do is gather information to have recommendations put forward so we can put something in the model and be able to say, yes, this looks good, or based on what we put in the model, the recommendations to the governor and the legislature would be slightly different because this outcome is either not what was anticipated or perhaps not in the best interest of the students of our state, or through this process, we've identified an even better approach.
Okay, good. Lisa and then Paul, Member Johnson, you're after Lisa.
All right. Thank you, Chair McCormick. I just, in the same vein as Member Casey, I just had a question. So on the screen that's what's showing on the screen, that the NDE versus the APA. I mean, wait a minute, it's so hard to see. One says actual funds and one says budgeted funds. Are we, how are we going to try to reconcile that? In other words, budgeted funds, can somebody like define what that means versus the available funds? Does that mean whatever the state has on hand, that's what you're going to get and that's how you would determine your weights? Or are we talking about we would call our aspirational? I just didn't feel, I wasn't sure how we were going to reconcile it based on whatever funds the districts actually receive.
Heidi, could you maybe outline the difference between bullet choice 2, the 1.4, and the difference between that and bullet point 3, which comes up with the 0.36? What's the difference?
For the record, Heidi Hartz. So bullet 2 indicates available funds divided by the number of eligible students. Under the Nevada plan, gifted and talented funding is allocated to school districts in just that manner. We take the available funds divided by the number of eligible students, and that amount of money is distributed to each school district based on the number of qualifying students that they have anticipated to be enrolled in their schools for the upcoming school year. When we do convert that to a multiplier, which is different than the way we currently fund gifted and talented services now, the multiplier works out to be 0.14. Under the February blueprint, we took budgeted information. Again, the Nevada plan is budgeted as well. This is the approved budgets that both the school districts and the state have to work with fiscal year 20. So when we looked at what was budgeted within the Department of Education, in this case for gifted and talented, and what school districts had reflected in their budgets for the current fiscal year under gifted and talented, working that through to become a multiplier, the multiplier then became 0.36.
And maybe the district CFOs understand it. I'm just trying to figure out how you would reconcile it.
So, and that's part of, Lisa, I think that's part of, and anybody feel free to jump in. I think that's the part of the conversation where we're saying, is the conversation about the ability of a district to select, to add dollars on top of what is given to them by the state or provided, allocated by the state, to put toward a particular program. So I know this is probably not good. I feel like I might be dividing or adding averages here, subtracting averages, which is never good. But if there's 3.6 when you include the dollars that districts have chosen to allocate toward GATE from what the state is given, there appears to be an additional 0.22 that is based on district decisions to allocate money.
Okay.
As opposed to, this is how much, like, in other words, say you personally have 2 streams of funding coming in, and this funding is supposed to be for, I'll use like scholarships idea, right? This funding is supposed to be for textbooks. Well, you want to buy a couple extra textbooks, so what you do is you take money out of what mom and dad sent you and put it toward textbooks. Now, you've increased the total weight of the overall amount of money that you have. Probably not the best analogy, but it's morning and it's Friday.
Right. No, I understand that, but with that, then take away from some of the other dollars that are supposed to be. Okay, there we go. I've got it. Okay.
But on the bottom scenario, and Heidi, I'm looking for you to correct me. The way I think about it is if we adopt the bottom scenario we are forever holding every district to allocating a certain amount above and beyond what the state has provided, versus allocating or starting the world, or holding the world, not starting, but the aspiration is at what the state will allocate, and then the district still has the flexibility. They still have the ability to allocate additional without necessarily disrupting or setting that standard forever. Back to what I think Member Jensen mentioned, which is you may have different students, you may have different needs, you may have different programs that may cost different amounts that will require you not to put in as much or may require you to put in more. As a district, that becomes their decision. Paul, I didn't forget you. Lisa, do you have any more questions? And I'll be quiet for a while.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just kind of a comment. I had much more information I was going to say, but I think I'll just condense it to, this rate is fine, but I have no idea what that means in terms of dollars for our school district budget. And basically we have $5 billion that we're going to slice up. We're going to put some in gifted and talented sped and whatever else, and it's going to be based on these weights. Currently 11 school districts don't even get any special education or GATE funding. So I really guess in theory I can agree to any of the weights that we as a group agree to, but I would like to have the flexibility that once we get this model put together that we can make changes at that time once we see what the end results are.
Understood. And we can either make sure that's in the motion, but I think Heidi Hart's already mentioned that part of this is to set up the exercise for the districts to be able to submit and for us to compare. But Paul, certainly we can include that. Member Jensen?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Member Jensen, for the record, I think one point I need to wrap my head around and understand as I'm considering these. And so my question goes to Jeremy and to Heidi. As I look at section 15, subsection 2, I keep hearing about base year, and then I think, Heidi, you said, and the commission can determine the base year. That's not how I read section 15, subsection 2, in which base year is defined as the year ending on June 30th, 2020. So that, for me, it throws a red flag and a concern if we as a commission don't even know at this point what our base year is. Am I reading this wrong?
Heidi Hartz for the record. So for the purposes of the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan, the legislature identified that it was not their intent for any school district to receive less funding moving forward in fiscal years 22, 23, and beyond than they were appropriated or authorized for in fiscal year 2020. As I mentioned previously, for state agencies, when we build a biennial budget, the even numbered fiscal year is our base budget year, and we build from that point forward. I think when we are setting the weights, when you are recommending weights, it's important to recognize that we're setting the weights for the calculation that will be used for fiscal year 2022. And again, I think that we're trying to offer some flexibility, recognizing that not every school district invests in programs like Gifted and Talented similarly, but also being respectful of the fact that when we move to the pupil-centered funding plan, and more revenues are going from local school districts into the state education fund, school districts may lose some of that flexibility that they currently have to identify what additional programs or activities they would like to invest in.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think you were going to make a comment, and then I've just got one thought that's just stewing. Jeremy?
I don't disagree with anything that Heidi just said. I think that Section 15 deals with the establishment of the hold harmless. And so for purposes of that calculation, that does establish it at 2020. And Dave, I think the way you're reading it is accurate. I actually think that there's a bit of a different concept that's contemplated in Section 4 of SB 543. Both in Section Section 4, subsection 1, as well as Section 4, subsection 5. It doesn't deal with the concept of a base year. It deals with the concept of the immediately preceding fiscal year. And because of that, I think that those are two separate concepts for establishing what the starting point is for any particular year. I mean, Heidi obviously has a much better grasp, as do many of you, in terms of what the budgeting requirements are. But in terms of the concepts that are set forth in Senate Bill 543, I think that's the distinguishing factor that is perhaps creating at least some of the confusion.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Heidi. Member Jensen, for the record, the only thing I just want to leave this on, and why I'm asking that question and sticking to this, as we're trying to make some decisions as a commission, I believe we have to do it off of FY20 as the base year, because we already know that budgets are subject to 6, 10, 14% reductions next year. How that applies and how that rolls out, we have no idea. But if we're trying to establish a base year with an unknown, how does Jeremy run calculations? So we've got to set the base year. We've got to have that ability to start plugging in numbers and looking at it. We know this year, we have no idea what next year is going to be at this point.
If I recall, and do we have anybody else who has a comment? Otherwise, if I recall, Member Jensen, you had a motion on the table a while back. Do you remember the motion? Did you want to edit it or repeat? If you could at least repeat it, and if you want to edit it in any way based on the discussion, that would be good to mention.
My motion was that we adopt the gate multiplier at 0.4. I would add what Mark had mentioned in his comment, and that we set the target at 0.14.
Okay, and Member Johnson.
Yeah, if we just add the flexibility to change that at a later date if necessary.
I think everything's flexible at this point.
I just don't want people to get focused on the 0.14 and have that be a fixed number, and there has to be understanding that this is a fluid process.
Member Jensen, are you willing to add that to your motion, or?
I think that's consistent with everything we have motioned at this point or adopted, is that there's got to be the understanding this is fluid. So yes, I would include that. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. In that case, do I have a second?
I seconded last time. This is Jim McIntosh for the record. I'll second this time.
Thank you. All righty. Jessica, are you still out there ready for
I'm here.
a vote? So all of, actually we'll go one by one. Jessica, if you want to go through the list, please.
Sure. Member Casey?
Yes.
Member Fueling?
I'm sorry, Chair, just for clarification on the what Dr. Jensen just said, I believe he said 0.4.
He amended it and went back to the 0.14, I believe. Member Jensen, just to confirm? Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
That was an error on my part. And then I saw Guy had his hand up. I want to make sure Guy has the ability to express before we vote.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I had exactly the same question that AJ had. I thought I heard 0.4. It's 0.14, correct?
Correct.
It's kind of breaking up a little bit here and there, so, okay.
Well, thank you, Guy, for clarifying 0.14.
Okay. Member Fueling?
Member Fueling, yes.
Thank you. Member Gowdy?
Yes.
Vice Chair Hobbs?
Yes.
Member Jensen?
Yes.
Member Johnson?
Yes.
Member Mathers?
Aye.
Chair McCormick Lee?
Yes.
Member McIntosh?
Yes.
Member Morris Hibler?
Yes.
Excellent.
The motion carries.
Okay. Alrighty. The good news is I think we got a lot of conversations that'll be pertinent to the other elements, which is good. So we've got some of the basic conversations clarified and moving on. So Heidi, are you ready to, Ms. Hartz?
I am. So for the record, Heidi Hartz. The next area that we would like to address pertains to the weights for special education. Again, this slide reflects some of the conversations that have been had to date. This indicates that the APA multiplier was recommended at 1.10. The Nevada plan, the multiplier that calculates out under our current business practice is 0.57. And the multiplier that calculates using the blueprint as of February is 1.45. Before making a recommendation to the Commission regarding weights for special education, we wanted to acknowledge that the Commission has raised a number of concerns regarding how to fund special education under the pupil-centered funding plan. This slide highlights some of those concerns. It certainly is not an exhaustive list. There are concerns about the ability of school districts to reallocate funding that would be awarded on a per pupil basis, which means that there could potentially be a lack of funding available to students whose services might cost more than the weighted funding. There are concerns about funding following a student to his or her school, because some school districts are providing centralized services for the purposes of special education. Additionally, there are concerns about looking at fiscal year 20 budgets and looking at school district budgets collectively, because each school district has a different maintenance of effort requirement with respect to special education services. Go ahead. So we have been next slide, considering options for how to potentially resolve this challenge as it exists. Senate Bill 543 does allow the superintendent to create additional budget accounts within the state education fund for the purposes of administering federal funds, as well as any match or maintenance of effort funding. Because special education is funded as a federal grant with a maintenance of effort requirement, it seems that under the provisions of Senate Bill 543, sections 2.5, the superintendent could create a separate account specifically for special education. This would, in essence, remove the need to establish a weight for students who qualify for special education services. It also appears that it would allow the Department of Education and our school districts to continue under our current business practices, where fundings are distributed to school districts for students who qualify for special education services, and then school districts provide those services to the identified students in a way that meets not only the needs of the student, but makes sense financially and from a workflow perspective for the school districts. I would note that if the Commission ultimately adopts this recommendation, that certainly the Commission's recommendations to the Governor and the Legislature would need to indicate that there's some cleanup language required in the law that would remove some of the requirements that pertain to establishing weighted funding specifically for students who qualify for special education services. So I would pause there to ask if the Commission has questions or thoughts regarding this alternative proposal before we circle back with the hopes of ultimately getting to a recommendation.
Okay, questions, thoughts? Heidi, I have a couple. So I'm going at this not from a fiscal angle, but from special ed codes. All right, so technically a student who might be hard of hearing, wears glasses, or gait in some parts of the countryside are coded as special education. So would any of that matter to this recommendation, I guess?
So this recommendation would not change any of the programmatic or legal requirements that apply for students who have an IEP or a 504 plan. All this does is change the way that the funding is addressed through the new funding formula, because it removes special education funding from the pupil-centered funding plan and allows the funding, both federal and state and local funds used for MOE, to be placed in a separate account.
Question, Member Jensen?
So Heidi, Member Jensen for the record, then thinking about the waterfall, and we're all hoping for future years when revenues come in, if we've got this separated out, how do we then try to support special education and try to get to that aspirational level of funding it beyond where we currently are?
For the record, Heidi Hartz. I believe that would be a conversation the commission would want to have once we get the model stood up and begin having conversations about optimal funding. I would also note that whenever we add additional funds for special education services, that does then increase the maintenance of effort requirement from that point moving forward.
So Member Gowdy, I know that a couple of those challenges in terms of using weights and tracking it to students were raised by you. How's this strategy strike you?
I'm not sure. I'm still just trying to comprehend how it all works. I mean, I think conceptually it helps. I mean, all of the, most of the concerns that were listed were a lot of what I had brought up earlier. Yeah, I've got a couple of pieces. One is, the section, there's, hold on a second, section 8.2, I believe, of the bill, where it talks about, well, I'm trying to find exactly, section 8.1B, and I think this kind of goes with, maybe this is why we're moving that way. There's some limitations, it looks like, where it says the base funds be used to support the educational needs of things that are not appropriated in the A, B, E, which are, I think, the weights. And so I think that, my concern is that, especially in special ed, is that the spend per pupil in Clark, as we noted in the weights, is higher than probably everybody else, or at least in on average. And if we then just use the state funding, sorry, not state funding, the funding to the district as the measure of weight, then Clark will be left with having to fund a substantial amount of money out of the base in order to meet our maintenance of effort, which under that 8.1, I'm not sure that we can do. I think we need some help there. And so if this helps alleviate that issue, that would be beneficial. The other piece that was a significant concern, and it's more just, I think, for clarification for public, that Clark does not have the ability to send dollars for special education students to schools and have them pay for all their services. We have a very, very large department dedicated to special education related to the laws and all the requirements that need to do. And it's an allocation of services. We have a pretty good mechanism of tracking all the specific costs. I'm not worried about that, and I think that was also discussed in part of this recommendation. So, I'm just trying to fully comprehend it, but I think that the NDE has at least started down a path of trying to address some of these issues that don't just impact us, because, if you funded Clark County at an average of whatever the average is, we're okay because we're big enough to absorb one or two large cases. But if you go to some of the smaller districts, if they have one or two children that are in that high needs case, none of this matters to them anymore. You can fund it at 2 or 3 and it's still not going to meet, the fact that they might have a 1 or 2. So I think, again, this starts to address some of those concerns that we brought up. So I would say this is something to consider. It's a huge change, and I'm just trying to get my head around all of it.
Member Mathers?
Thank you, Mark Mathers, for the record. I guess I'm trying to understand better why this is being proposed. I mean, currently, the state provides, I think for most of us, about half of the special ed funding that we need. And so we do have a separate special revenue fund for special education, and the state allocation for special education funding is deposited there. And then we transfer general fund dollars into that special revenue fund, i.e. base dollars. And that's how we provide services to special education students. I'm trying to figure out why, so as an example, say we chose to adopt the APA target weight of 1.1. And again, our starting point is what we're currently allocated from the state, which is 0.57. And so presumably we adopt the APA target of 1.1. We get there eventually if there's additional funding provided into the system. Why doesn't the current setup work in that, we're going to get some fraction of what we actually need for some point in time, but SB 543 allows us to transfer base dollars into that account to provide those services. What's the problem with the current setup?
Why to provide those services?
So, Heidi Hartz, for the record, if I may.
I'm from the site.
The concerns that have been identified are the concerns that when we establish a multiplier and that amount of money then follows the child to their school, as it's specifically identified in Senate Bill 543. So if the multiplier generates a dollar value of $4,000 and you have 3 special ed students in a school, then they get that money. That creates a problem, as Clark County School District has identified, because they don't have the capacity to change, nor it sounds the interest, to change their existing structure where they're providing special education services from a centralized point of service provision. The other challenge is that when we move from the Nevada plan to the pupil-centered funding plan, the vast majority of local tax revenues will go into the state education fund, which means from the state education fund, we need to make sure that whatever funds are appropriated for special education services meet the maintenance of effort requirements for both the state and each individual school district. That may be difficult to do if we set one multiplier for the entire state based on all of applicable state and local resources. The other thing it could happen is a local school district could see their maintenance of effort responsibility increase because the multiplier will have them accountable for a higher level of match than they would have been under the current BIS model.
Mark, you look like you have another question. Just a quick question. So the recommendation Nevada Department of Ed is making, Heidi, is to not go with any weight. So it would be 2 pieces if the recommendation were accepted. 2 pieces. One would be to adopt the recommendation to utilize a separate account. And then the other would be that in June, July, when we are making recommendations to the governor, we would include a recommendation to alter, for lack of a better word, alter SB 543 language around special education and weights. So it's a 2-parter. I just want to know if I'm getting that correct.
For the record, Heidi Hartz, that is correct.
Okay. Sorry, Mike. Member Mathers, you had another question?
Yeah, thank you. I guess this gets into the reporting side, and maybe I'm just confused. Whether or not a special ed position is budgeted centrally or at a school, the cost of that service provided to the student at that school should, regardless of where they're budgeted, the cost should include the cost of the personnel that are providing the service, right? I mean, we're talking about a kind of a cost allocation system, and where they're originally budgeted, I don't think matters too much. The bottom line is whether they were budgeted at a central office or whether they're budgeted at the school, the cost is associated, the cost of services to that student should be reflected in the reporting. So I think, I guess I don't see that as an issue, but I understand better why you're making the recommendation you are, so I appreciate it.
Member Gowdy?
Yeah, I guess I want to get clarification because I think there's different information on whether or not base funds can be transferred into weights. And I brought up section 8.1B, and I think that's the right section. This talks about the adjusted base, and B reads, be used to support the educational needs of all pupils in the school district, including without limitation, operating each public school and the school district, training and supporting education personnel, and carrying out any program or service established by or requirement imposed pursuant to this title for any purpose for which specific funding is not appropriated pursuant to paragraph A, B, or E of subsection 2 of section 4, which I'd have to go back, but I think that's the weight piece of it. So I guess I'm just looking for clarification, and I'll look to Jeremy and to Heidi as to, I think that's important because if we do not have the ability to move base funds into the weights at the district to school level, that kind of changes the piece. And I think I think it sounds like we think we can, but I want to make sure that's right.
Heidi, you want to take it first, and then Jeremy, any follow-up?
Sure, Heidi Hartz for the record. So what section 8, subsection 1B is saying, yes, you're correct. That is referring to sections C and D, which would be the adjusted base per pupil amounts for school districts, and then the payments to charter schools, which you recall could be a combination of the state base per pupil amount for distance education and the adjusted base per pupil amount for kids who are attending a brick and mortar school. Senate Bill 543 does indicate that if a school district determines that additional money is needed for maintenance of effort, or a similar type of match for a federal special education requirements, the district may transfer money out of the adjusted base per pupil that's received by the district for that purpose. It does also indicate that the money that is allocated for each student in an identified category would follow them to their school.
Okay. I don't know whether I'm quoting Paul, and then Paul, I'll let you speak for yourself instead of me quoting you. I think it was either Member Johnson or Member Gowdy a couple meetings ago who said, and I'm paraphrasing probably, it doesn't really matter what the special ed weights are. We're required to spend X amount of dollars to meet the needs of the students based on their IEPs. So my non-accountant sense is that the Nevada Department of Ed gets you closer to being able to meet that in a fashion. So if I'm incorrect, I'd be curious to hear why not. Paul, Member Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to put something into perspective, and it was had to do with what Mark said about the percentage of revenue that comes from the state versus the amount of money that school districts transfer. Based on the 2019 387-303 report, 33% of special education expenditures were funded through state sources, and the other 66 plus a little bit more came from other sources. Mostly 66% was from transfers in. So there's a huge amount of money that school districts shift currently from their general fund over. It's my understanding there's a theory that a portion of that or the transfers are actually funded through the base. So, it'll be interesting. I'm not quite certain how this is going to, the mechanics are going to work and how this is going to affect maintenance of effort, or whether or not we now are going to record all of those expenditures as special education expenditures within our general fund. Because years ago, all of these expenditures were recorded in the general fund. And then I think in around 1997, they were split so that they're recorded separately. So I'm not quite certain how this is even going to work with the ratio that we have here, and the maintenance of effort, and the fact that we don't have a choice. If we have to fund, we have to fund it. There's no obligation. There's no option for us to have a different amount. So whatever we dictate with respect to a ratio has, in some instances, may not have any relevance with respect to a caseload for a school district. We have charters have about 9% of their student population, and I think the highest school district has about 21% of their student population that's special education related. So fixing one ratio for all, that's going to be a tough one. And I guess I just wanted to point that out for information. Not that I really have a question, or I'm more trying to figure out the mechanics and how we're going to make this work.
Might be able to say that for a lot of this. Any other comments, questions? Dusty, Member Casey.
Thank you, Chair. Member Casey, for the record. So Heidi, if I could just kind of clarify, is this what you're proposing, or the department's proposing, essentially to loosen the restrictions that are placed on the special education funding within SB 543 and allow the department more flexibility in helping schools and school districts meet the maintenance of effort in whatever individual needs those are, rather than the blanket restrictions in SB 543?
Heidi Hartz for the record. So the recommendation to establish an account specifically for special education is intended to take the funding methodology out of the pupil-centered funding plan and retain what is currently in place within the state. In doing that, it would not add the restrictions that are outlined in Senate Bill 543, for example, to allocate the money, the weighted money for a student with special education needs to their school. It would also then allow the school districts, as they have now, flexibility to take the pot of money, the amount of money that they receive, and serve the students who are eligible for additional services, rather than trying to figure out how to accommodate a student who may have a need for lesser services, who's receiving the same amount of money of a student who has more expensive services that they are needing in order to be successful in school. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you, Heidi.
So any other questions? Oh, AJ, Member Shuling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I understand the kind of the maintenance of effort problem within this. I think a large part of the problem, and I think I've said this before, the language of the bill, I guess the intent of having money follow the kids and the reality of that. And I think it is a very wonderful goal, but I think it is very impractical in terms of trying to show that. And that clearly comes up here with some of Member Gowdy's comments. But it seems to me that if we are moving down this path, you are going to have the same problem with EL, and you're going to have the same problem with FRL. You have district level people doing these things. So if we're going to go down this path here with special ed, I would think the recommendation would be the same for EL and the at-risk, unless I'm missing something.
You're not missing anything.
For the record, Heidi Hartz, this is an option for special education because special education is funded primarily through federal funds, and then the state and local school districts provide our specific general fund revenues to meet the maintenance of effort requirement. For ELs and for at-risk students, we do not currently have a maintenance of effort requirement in the state budget for any federal grants.
Now, how does that happen when you have Title I and you have no maintenance of effort for Title I? Now, everybody needs to understand what you just said. There's not a maintenance of effort in Nevada for Title I.
Any other?
At risk.
Yes.
Free and
Member
reduced.
Johnson and then Member Fueling. Johnson, then Fueling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing I think is really significant at this point is that we're going to establish a rate, but it's important for us to all understand that when we are looking at a 14% decrease in funding potentially next year, that decrease is not going to be coming out of special education because each school district is going to be fixed at its maintenance of effort.
What's going on? Somebody's moving, but somebody's stuck.
Paul, you froze, and I don't know about other people. I can't hear you.
I'm still.
Because of financial adversity, but school districts cannot. So I think we need to be aware that if this, whatever this rate is, when the budget goes down, which it seems like it's going to change whatever rate that we have, and it could exceed whatever threshold that we identified.
Okay, understood. Member Fueling?
I guess going back to the kind of comments and questions before, and thank you for your response. I guess I'm still struggling. I understand that based on the language of the bill, special ed would be the only category eligible because it receives federal funds. But then the issue of centralized expenses doesn't go away. And this doesn't exactly help it. I mean, it's still the same problem. It doesn't matter where the money is. The problem's the same. If you're trying to track this money down to the child, it's not reasonable. So I don't know, it doesn't exactly help with conversation on the weight, but I still think this, as a recommendation that comes out of this commission, I think that there has to be some additional language that comes from us about what that looks like, or what is truly reasonable, and how much detail you have to be able to drill down to. I mean, it's hard enough in a small district, and I cannot fathom what that looks like in Clark or Washoe. So just, I guess, finishing up my point.
Okay. So do I have any, the closest thing I heard to a motion was something Member Johnson said. He said I'd be comfortable. Or maybe not, maybe comfortable wasn't the word. So do we have a motion regarding the recommendation that Nevada Department of Ed has made with some potential caveats?
Okay. Sorry, Madam Chair, sorry. So I just wanted to make sure I understand. So by staying with the current setup, so in the current setup that NDE uses, there is a weight attributed, although it varies. So what we're saying is that there would be no special education weight. In fact, there would be like we always see kind of the statewide average, but there would effectively be no special education weight, which I believe the Senate bill says there is supposed to be.
Heidi, you're going to check my understanding, and or you can answer it. But my understanding is that based on SB 543, there is one component that indicates if the primary funds come from federal and have a maintenance of effort requirement, which is, to me, the key piece. Because we receive federal funds for Title I for poverty, we receive federal funds for ELL, but that concept of maintenance of effort is somewhat unique to the special education funding. So my understanding is the recommendation would be to not identify a specific weight, to continue with the maintenance of effort, that the dollars would be allocated, for lack of a better word, earlier in the waterfall. So it would be essentially a separate account that would have the dollars from the state. It would work similarly to what you're doing right now with the district maintenance of effort, and therefore it could adjust as the district adjusts, and there would be no wait. There would need to be a recommendation if we choose that one. There would also need to be a recommendation from this group to change, modify, adjust the law to indicate no special education wait. Heidi, what did I get right? What did I not?
For the record, Heidi Hartz, I would agree with your summary. Let me just add to this that as we have reviewed all of the funding sources and expenditure sources within the NDE budgets, under the provisions of Senate Bill 543, we excluded from the pupil-centered funding plan all federally funded programs and all general funds that were intended to be match for those federally funded programs. When we looked at the bill, we did not treat special education funding the same way because of the way the bill was written. Based on the conversations that the commission members have had over the last 6 months, we've circled back and have asked ourselves, thus the recommendation to all of you today, that maybe the best option is to treat our special education funding as federal funding with a required match or maintenance of effort. So it brings it more in alignment with how other federal funds are being treated. But you are correct, there would then be no established multiplier within the tier level E, the categories of services for which multipliers are required.
AJ?
Very good information. Yeah, I thought.
So looking at, excuse me, section 2, sub 5, it reads, so this account that we're talking about, the money in any such account must not be considered when calculating the statewide base per pupil funding amount,
That's right. It's not even
or appropriating money from the state education fund. And when I think of this, our funding for education, I think of it as one large whole. And how it seems to me that the amount of money in this special education account and the amount of money that will be used to determine the statewide base per pupil are inextricably linked with a finite pool of resources. So if, one is going to be a function of the other, and I think it goes both ways based on the total amount of the pot. So I don't know if that's a question, but it seems to me that the way the language is written is more the idea of, like it was really written more so for the federal funds going into some separate fund. But in this case, when you're taking state money out of that finite pot, that is going to be impacted, and I would think still has to be considered when you're talking about the statewide base per pupil, just because of the limited resources that are there. And maybe that just needs kind of further legal look or clarification. I don't know.
Heidi, do you by any chance have the A, B, C, that slide close by? Or is that possible? Or just if you could reference it, that might help. At least it would help me think about where does that happen?
Heidi Hartz for the record. So I do not have the slide readily available, and under the provisions for which we're having a meeting, we would have to have that available for everyone, including those on the phone.
Right. Right.
So currently, the statewide base per pupil funding amount is calculated off of the revenues going into tier levels C and D, which would be the funding going to charter schools, university schools for the profoundly gifted, and school districts. The money that is used to fund the Department of Education and the State Board of Education, any money that would be intended to fund auxiliary services such as transportation, and any funding used to support the weights would not be included in the calculation of the statewide base per pupil funding amount. Similarly, any funds, federal funds or other funds that would be used as matched to federal funds would not be included in that statewide base per pupil funding amount.
Okay. So unless we have another question, I think what we have in front of us is a couple, and Member Mathers, give me 30 seconds to recap what I think I know. What I think I know is we have 4 options in front of us. We have a multiplier of 1.10, which is based on a recommendation from APA. An ND Nevada plan multiplier of 0.57 that is based on the current Nevada plan. We have the February blueprint, which was, and I'm going to try to use Member Gowdy's great language, that is a combination of the dollars that come from the state to the district, as well as those dollars that the districts have determined they would like to allocate to schools, which is a multiplier of 1.45. And then the last option, option 4, is a separate account, which would essentially function similar to the way it functions now. I think we've sort of batted these around and talked about the challenges of each and every one of them. The question is, what is it that we choose to do? Member Mathers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mark Mathers for the record. Kind of along those lines, I mean, I hear the state's proposal. I think a lot of us CFOs are struggling to kind of think it through it. I'm not sure we're ready to vote on that. But I know the notion here today is to get closure on the weights and to stand up the model. And even if we decide the state's proposal to set up a separate accounting and flow of funds is approved either today or at some subsequent meeting, that will require statutory change, and we don't know if that will go through. So I think we really have to just stick to our knitting, at least in one motion here, and decide on that target weight so that Jeremy can put that into his model and we go forward. So that's my focus here today, and I think we've established that the kind of starting point is based on the current NDE allocations to each of these weights, which in this case would be 0.57. So to me, it makes sense to approve whatever we think is the appropriate target weight at this point, and then consider the second motion about setting up a separate account or recommendation for a separate account separately.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're on mute.
I turned myself to mute already. So we've got Member Johnson, then Casey, then Gowdy, and then I think Member Hobbs. So, but Member Mathers, that sounded sufficiently close to a motion, so don't lose the thought, okay? Member Johnson?
Well, Mark kind of hit the nail on the head. As I was taking a look at this, we have a couple of tasks here. We have the target, because we have to think of adequacy in addition to optimal, and I think those are two different concepts. Optimal to me is getting the square peg to fit in a round hole, and we have to identify the where we want to be. So if that's the 1.45, and when we multiply that with what we think the weight is, when we come up with the amount of money, that's the amount of money that we ultimately want to raise. And I think that's what Mark was getting to. And then we have to figure out what do we do from here to there. And I want to thank Heidi and the Department of Education for coming up with this flexibility. And I think with Mark, maybe a hybrid of the two of an aspirational rate. And in the meantime, we have a separate account might fit the needs of what we need to do going forward. But I think it was pretty creative, and I appreciate the work that they did with respect to that separate account.
Okay. Member Casey.
Yeah, real quick. Mark and Paul kind of hit it on the head. This is Member Casey for the record. Heidi, I really appreciate the alternate idea by NDE. It may be something that works actually really well, but I'm kind of with Mark in that I feel like it alters the plan and what's in SB 543 significantly, especially funding it now up above in levels A or B or somewhere before the rest of the waterfall. I feel like it alters that quite a bit. And if my understanding is correct, you're basically asking us to recommend to change the bill and strip out the special education funding the way it's written in the bill. And in order to stand up the model, I think that's kind of a big task that I don't know that we're ready for. So I kind of agree with Mark in that we need to get the bill stood up as SB 543 is written.
Member Gowdy.
Thank you, Jason Gowdy, for the record. One quick point as we start talking about the weight, Amanda did talk earlier that there was significant work on their part put into all weights with the exception of gate. And there was a lot of work on that one, but substantially more put into the other ones. So I think that as we start talking about what the experts believe is at least the right, and I'll use the term aspirational or whatever the target weight for funding at the state level, again, taking the state funding to the districts as that's, I believe that's the way they interpret that weight at the 1.1. I realize as a state funding that it's significantly lower, but we all know, as Paul mentioned earlier, funded from general funds, which is taking away services from the general population of students that should be receiving a better education and allocating it to a small group. And that's because it's required by law. So I think as we start talking about that, I think that Amanda's point earlier, there was a substantial amount of work put into that 1.1, at least as a starting point. And I'm well aware of all the challenges. And then I wanted to get clarification from Jeremy and on really kind of what I'll call legislative intent. When I hear, I express concern that there is the possibility of perception of actual dollars having to follow every single special education student, and that's just not practical. And I've heard Heidi talk about that was one of the reasons that the NDE proposed this additional model, because it kind of helps protect against that. I appreciate that effort, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm still convinced that the legislative intent was that specific, that we actually have to take every single special education student and only give them 1.1. The way I interpret it is we get 1.1 from the state, and then we still meet our MOE within that. And that means that there would be some students in the same category that are not exact funded, but still appropriately funded. But Jeremy, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on the legislative intent of how strict that really was, or what we should really think about doing.
Sure. For the record, Jeremy Aguirre, I'll try and provide whatever context that I can relative to this. And the conversations that were had during the legislative session, this issue came up a great deal, not only in terms of the weights, but also in terms of the base, right? The concept that, the exact same amount of money is not going to follow every single student in each individual district. You're not going, from a base perspective, going to be allocating the same amount of money to every elementary school student and every middle school student and every high school student. That would be impractical and sort of perverse relative to what was intended, right? The idea was that similarly situated students would receive similarly situated allocations of funds. That's the sort of heart and soul of the per pupil funding plan. Relative to special education, the way it was discussed was that those allocations would essentially be blocked for each individual school district. And at the individual school district level, there would likely be multiple allocations. I know someone had brought up once before, at least the last one that I was involved with, that there were something like 9 separate sort of standard identifications in terms of level of severity of need for individual students that are in those categories, and that would have to be allocated based on that. Not unlike how an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school student, there's just different needs with the concept and the idea that similarly situated students are treated the same. Even in terms of things like the at-risk students, there was some conversation that went on about whether or not, every at-risk student would receive the same amount of funding, or whether that would even need to be tiered somehow based on the specific needs of that at-risk student in some particular neighborhood. Now, obviously, there was some particular flexibility that's in the back language of the bill, but Mr. Gowdy, I think the way that you outlined it is correct in terms of the concept being that similarly situated students within each district will receive the same amount of funds, and that the base would be protected and the weights would be protected such that that could ultimately be accomplished.
Okay, Member Hobbs.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate all of the comments that have been made. I'm going to go ahead and take a shot at crafting a motion for you. Based on what I've heard, it seems like there's a fair amount of common thinking going on here. First and foremost, to the Nevada Department of Education and Heidi for thinking outside the box and trying to come up with a creative way of dealing with this. I too share a bit of the discomfort that we're now involving ourselves in, possibly, notwithstanding the fact that it may be the best approach, that we're actually rewriting the intent of 543, and I'm not quite sure that's where we should be at this point. With respect to the weights, I would make a motion that for purposes of running an initial iteration of the model or stand up the model, however you want to term it, that we consider using the APA recommended weight of 1.10 for special education.
What's special ed getting in there?
Subject to all the normal caveats that we can look at it again and come back and reevaluate.
Excellent. Thank you for including those.
This is Jason. I will second.
Okay. Jessica, are you out there? We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion prior to taking the vote? Okay, Jessica, if you would move through the list, please.
Sure. Member Casey?
Yes.
Member Fueling?
Yes.
Member Gowdy?
Yes.
Member Hobbs?
Yes.
Member Jensen?
Yes.
Member Johnson?
Yes.
Member Mathers?
Yes.
Chair McCormick Lee?
Yes.
Member McIntosh?
Yes.
Member Morris Hebler?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. I'd like, Member Hobbs would like to say thank you to Nevada Department of Ed for listening to our conversations over time and attempting to devise something that would accommodate the districts, especially given the concerns that were expressed. So thank you. Moving on to the next weight. Heidi, are you ready?
Yes, for the record, Heidi Hartz. The next weight for your consideration today is for at-risk students. The options that have been presented to the Commission on School Funding up to this point in time are listed on the left side of the slide. APA recommended a multiplier of 0.30. Based on our current Nevada plan, the funds for at-risk students are reflected in our Victory funds, and those funds are divided by the eligible number of students and then dispersed to each school district. The school districts then reallocate those funds within their districts based on their district policy. The multiplier based on the fiscal year 20 budget equals 0.47. We look at the February version of the blueprint and we consider the funds that are also invested in at-risk services for children across the state. The multiplier increases to 0.64. As a starting point, the recommendation is to start with a multiplier of 0.47. I did want to note that the Commission has asked the Department of Education previously to explore other definitions for at-risk students other than those who qualify for a free and reduced price lunch. The department did make a presentation or several presentations at a previous Commission on School Funding meeting. And we remain committed to looking at other definitions for at-risk students. And we would hope to come back to perhaps the May meeting with some additional information. So this would admittedly be a placeholder to share with you information on what other states are considering or have considered and what their success has been. We've also learned Infinite Campus has a risk indicator program available that looks at several factors in identifying students who may be designated as at risk. And we are working on trying to schedule that presentation during the May meeting from Infinite Campus.
Heidi, did you want to take 30 seconds to give a brief who is Infinite Campus? Some folks may know from districts, but others might not.
Heidi Hartz for the record. I will attempt to give an explanation. Infinite Campus is the service provider through which we track student enrollment data and attendance data. I'm waiting for a phone a friend to come help me. Hang on. Megan has to walk closer. She wrote the answer on a sheet of paper and I cannot see it from my social distancing position.
We need to get
It's a student information system.
Yes.
It is a student information system.
And it does.
If you'd like more information, I would be happy to let Megan share that with you.
Megan, I don't think we need a whole presentation on it. Megan, did you want to add anything real quickly? I just want to make sure everybody knew what Infinite Campus was since you used the company title or the system title.
This is Megan Peterson for the record. It is the system that our school districts use to track attendance, grades, enrollment, and additional information for teachers to assist their students. It's also available to parents to assist with their students' education as well.
Wow.
Okay, thank you. So lots of data in there to be able to use. Okay. So I think, again, we have essentially 3 recommendations here to be able to take a look at and consider. So let's go ahead and conversation, questions, discussion. Member Mathers. And Member Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess the concern I have a little bit is the current multiplier is based on not the total base of FRL students that we're considering. In other words, So we know even in Washoe County schools, not all FRL children receive victory funds. And so that 0.47 is calculated in an artificially low base. As most people know, only Washoe and Clark got any victory money. So there's a whole bunch of FRL kids in other districts that got no money. So I think, although the calculation's correct, as shown, that was based on the statute that set up the victory program. And 0.47 is not actually what, on a statewide basis, we're providing funding for all at-risk children. So I wanted to clarify, and I think this goes back to kind of the information that was presented to the legislature. My recollection was the effective weight for at-risk was something like 0.05. Jeremy?
That's correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're not actually going down from the current 0.47 to 0.3. We'd be going up. If we adopted the aspirational target of 0.3, we'd be going up from 0.05 to 0.3, which I would be in favor of. I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. Member Jensen, then Member Johnson.
Member Jensen for the record. Member Mathers really addressed what I was going to bring to the table. We do have a little bit of victory monies here in Humboldt, so it's not just in Clark and Washoe. There are a few rurals that have it, but the definition for victory is narrow, so I will defer to the comments that Mark made.
Okay. Member Johnson?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you. This one seems to be a bit easier for me than the other ones, and I would make a motion that we accept APA's recommended weight with the continued direction to NDE to explore other definitions for at-risk.
Okay. Do I have a second for that motion?
I'll second.
Mathers. Any discussion, questions? Okay, in that case, Jessica, you want to go ahead and take the
Yes,
vote?
Madam Chair. Member Casey?
Yes.
Member Fueling?
Yes.
Member Gowdy?
Yes.
Vice Chair Hobbs? You're on mute.
Yeah.
Thank you. Member Jensen?
Yes.
Member Johnson?
Yes.
Member Mathers?
Yes.
Chair McCormick Lee?
Yes.
Member McIntosh?
Yes.
Member Morris Hebler?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay. All righty. Heidi, are we at English language learners, ELs?
For the record, Heidi Hartz, the next recommendation before the commission is to generate a recommendation for weights for English learners. Again, summarizing the options presented to the commission on school funding thus far include the APA recommendation. Their multiplier is 0.50. Using the Nevada plan and the funds currently included in the NDE budget for Zoom, the multiplier would equate to 0.21. And looking at the blueprint as of February, that reflects budgeted expenditures from both NDE and the school districts. The multiplier equals 0.27. Under recommendations, I do want to note that there is a typo. The recommendation to increase the multiplier should be between 0.26 and 0.50. So I apologize. 0.27 should indeed be 0.26. I would note that if the commission were to make a recommendation to go with 0.26, that could result in the need for increased funding if based on the current multiplier within the NDE budget. It would potentially result in less funding overall based on the multiplier from the blueprint.
Okay, again, a recommendation between 0.26 and 0.50 with 3 elements in front of us, APA, 0.50, the ND Nevada plan connected to the Zoom calculations of 0.21, or the February blueprint of multiplier of 0.27. Discussion? Member Mathers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mark Mathers for the record. So just a question. I mean, this is the last weight, I believe, that we're going to vote on. So will there be a separate motion or item today for how we get to those target weights, the aspirational / target weight for each weight? Are we going to vote on that separately, or how would we do that?
I want to clarify, or let me ask a question about what you're asking about, because I think these are the weights that we're asking Nevada Department of Ed and Applied Analysis to use in their calculations and their comparison for the Nevada plan to the pupil-centered plan for the exercise that is going to occur. For getting to a point where they are aspirational weights at the dollar amount where we hope they would be funded, to me, that's part of the optimal discussion that will begin to occur in the summer. Am I understanding what you're asking, or am I off?
Yeah, the question is, I presume the blueprint that we'll see starts off at these starting points. And then as new funding is added into the system, right over time, the state will be able to get to those target weights. And I just wonder, on a policy level, if we're going to make any recommendation for, the process or the mathematical calculation of how we get there. Are we all going to sprinkle the money between the 4 weights proportionately or not? That's what I'm asking.
Gotcha. I understand. And actually, that has been a part of the conversation. Member McIntosh, correct me if I'm wrong, but that has been part of the conversation with the reporting and monitoring group. WestEd has gone through a discussion in terms of what other states have done. Again, because of the work we needed to get accomplished today to be able to give guidance to districts over the course of the next couple months, or next 2 months, we did not bring that into the conversation for yesterday today. However, and I'll look to Heidi on when we're going to bring that back, but WestEd in February presented to the reporting and monitoring group concepts and ways that other states have brought those elements in, where they've decided all new dollars went to the base. All new dollars went to I think one option was the weight that was further from the aspirational weight. So they presented 2 or 3 different mechanisms or possibilities, and that group has been talking through some of those, and that will also come to the larger group as a whole, much like this work has done. Member McIntosh, do you want to clean up whatever I said?
No, thank you, Chair Lee. You're absolutely correct. And so I would look forward to WestEd providing that presentation in the future.
Great. Ms. Hartz, do you want to, Heidi, do you want to adjust anything I just said or add to it?
For the record, Heidi Hartz. No, I think your summary was very well presented.
Okay, good. All right, I should note the date and time. At any rate, so any other questions? Did that help, Member Mathers? So yes, we are. Okay, good. And I do think that's a critical piece. That's an important piece for the work as we move forward. Standing up, I've always said, standing up a formula is one piece of what we need to have a conversation about. The good news is there's some time to have the other pieces. Any other questions, conversations about this? Do I hear a motion anywhere?
Hey, this is Jason. Sorry, I was trying to, my computer's having a couple issues.
Been there, done that. Any questions?
Yeah, I did. I just want to understand. So I guess maybe a point and maybe a question. So as we look at ELL funds and the NDE funded at the 0.2 and the APA again at the 0.5. And again, I want to go back to my comment earlier about the substantial amount of work of trying to set what the correct way should be in order to provide the services for ELL students at the 0.5. So I think that's an important concept, again, to bring back up. I also want to point out that, you know, in that SB $178, if this is just, if that effective weight at 0.21 is just looking at Zoom dollars and Zoom children, there's still SB $178 that are both technically applied to at-risk and ELL students, just not at Zoom and Victory School. So there's some other funds that might, if you included that in, would drive that up. Now, what Mark mentioned earlier, that doesn't include the entire denominator either. So I think there's a couple considerations. Also the fact that we only use the highest weight, that means that there are some students that we know cost a little bit more. And I know that's what we're going to use for this model, and I really want to explore that in the future, but it becomes very complicated. But I think what that does is that adds to the advocacy in my mind of using the APA weight of 0.5, because again, there are going to be some students that have additional needs that kind of get used up all in that first weight, whatever that first weight is, and there's some other costs. And I think if we ignore the experts in this area and setting what we believe is the right way to get there, now we know there's additional funding required, but I think that's part of what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to look at what's right. This then drives where are the gaps and then what we have to do. So I just wanted to make those couple of comments and kind of put SB 178 into context as well.
Great, thank you. Member Johnson, was that want to make a comment? Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. And I appreciate the information that Jason just mentioned. And personally, I'm not comfortable just picking a number between 0.26 and 0.5 without some sort of validity to the figures. I agree that we have, you know, all of these weights and this information was a result of an adequacy study. What we're wanting to determine is what should we be funding at, not where we're at currently. So I think the 0.5 makes sense to me, with the understanding that it's probably going to, the effective weight is going to be something that's different than that, and we're going to have the flexibility to change and move toward that higher rate. And I'd be willing to make a motion that we accept EPA's rate of 0.5 with the understanding that this is a fluid process and we need to have flexibility in order to change these things as the model develops and we see the actual dollar amounts.
I will make a second.
I heard, yes, I heard, thank you. That's exactly what I was asking for. Sorry, I was on mute. So we have a motion, we have a second. Any further discussion? Okay, Jessica, Member Casey, did you want to make a comment? Nope, okay.
He was just
Jessica?
ready to vote, Madam Chair. He knows he's first.
I know. That is apparently what it is. Okay, go ahead.
Member Casey?
Yes.
Member Fueling?
Yes.
Member Gowdy?
Yes.
Vice Chair Hobbs?
Yes.
Member Jensen?
Yes.
Member Johnson?
Yes.
Member Mathers?
Yes.
Chair McCormick-Lee?
Yes.
Member McIntosh?
Yes.
Member Morris-Hibler?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Excellent. Okay, with that, I want to do a quick check. I am fine not taking a lunch break and moving through 4, 5, and 6, and 7, but I did want to take maybe a 5-minute stretch, move around break. So is there anybody who wants to take a longer lunch break, or are we okay? I'm seeing a lot of no's. Let's just move through it. So let's meet back in 5 minutes, take a stretch, get a glass of water, and we'll be back here in 5. And then Heidi, I believe we're ready to move on to your education update and number 5. Okay?
Okay, so we can start a new share. And where are we going to share? I thought I opened that, but I guess I didn't. Things are just here. Open. I'm going to do that. Now, change it. Mute it. Mute next. More. More here. How is that new share? I'll have to learn about that. But I am going to start a new share. This one. And when they come back, I will, she didn't mute the room, so I will mute the room. Okay, let's see. Did I? That way. I'm not sure if I'm here or what's being on the camera. But this is a file that I downloaded that was sent to me because I was signed up in the room for this. I'm just going to pause right now. Oh, I'm going to resume share. Oh my God. This is what I did for last time. So I'm going to stop. And I'm going to pause.
Define at-risk students in a way other than those eligible for free and reduced lunch. And I mentioned that in more detail in my previous presentation. At the June meeting, we will hopefully be able to review the specific reporting requirements included in Senate Bill 543 to look at the model using fiscal year 20, 22, and 23 financial information. At that point, we may be able to do some preliminary work around hold harmless. And then, of course, allow the commission to continue their conversations regarding recommendations to the governor and the legislature. We have several items on our to-do list where we have not yet set a specific meeting date for those to be included in the agenda. And that would, of course, include the recommendations from West Ed, and then working with the reporting and monitoring work group or the entire commission to identify an evaluation study or strategy to track implementation and to develop the necessary guidance documents for implementation. I do want to keep in mind that We recognize that the evaluation strategy, as well as the guidance documents for implementation, will no doubt change over time as we move through the budget building process, and we see what the governor includes in his recommended budget, and then ultimately what the legislature approves in their legislatively approved budget. There are still several opportunities for changes to be made, both to the pupil-centered funding plan in and of itself, as well as its implementation. With that, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you or the commission members may have.
Questions from anybody? Sounds like a busy couple of months. Just one question. Heidi, have you thought about, seems like the timeline, if the request to the legislative council goes in June, that probably means that we would not have anyone on board to begin work on the optimal till maybe August, September? Am I guessing correctly?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. At this point in time, we would not anticipate having a consultant on board to assist with conversations regarding optimal funding until the fall.
Okay, that's what I thought. But it does sound like between the, and I'll refer back to Member Mather's question about, as we start to think to bring things on board, those are some areas that West Ed is exploring. So it sounds to me like a focus for the future work could be some of the elements that West Ed has already presented, exploring those, the implementation, the evaluation, as well as considering as additional dollars may come on board that are identified during the optimal, how would those be brought on board? Does that make sense?
So Heidi Hart, for the record, yes, the work that West Ed has done would contribute to the development of the guidance for implementation, as well as recommendations for how to monitor implementation. With respect to optimal funding, the commission can commence that work if we have the ability to bring on a consultant to facilitate that process. It seems that would be helpful as well, keeping in mind that any recommendations made under optimal funding, also the commission's responsible for identifying how those recommendations would be funded.
Correct. Okay, it does sound like a busy few months, so I guess that's good news. Any questions from any commission members? Alrighty, I'm assuming that was number 4. Did you already manage to talk about number 5, or we can move on to number 5 if I don't hear any other questions? I don't see anybody asking questions of you. All right, in that case, let's move on to item number 5, update discussion regarding development of pupil-centered funding plan using fiscal year 2020 financial information. And that's a status from Jeremy of Applied Analysis.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. For the record, Jeremy Aguero. I think Heidi said it right in her update. We've been going back and forth a number of times. I'm sure I've become the bane of James's existence, but I do want to express my thanks to him for all of the information that he continues to provide as we go through this process. It's been tireless in terms of going back and forth and making sure that we make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to work with someone that's that diligent. In terms of the model itself, I'm happy to go through any pieces or parts that the commission may ultimately want. The model is completed. The blueprint, excuse me, is completed, including the introductory sections that I know Member McIntosh talked about a few times, and being able to sort of compare and contrast the Nevada plan versus the pupil-centered funding plan. The calculation schedules are all included. We've attempted to update the allocations for things like the small schools and the CWI based on the conversation that was had yesterday and the alternatives that were provided by APA in its presentation from yesterday. Those are all completed and ready for the Commission's consideration whenever it's appropriate to have that. In addition, the hold harmless modules have all been completed and built out. So when the Commission is ready to evaluate those and have a conversation about those, that's ready to go as well. The issue that currently exists with the blueprint is getting all of the information relative to the allocation of funds under the existing Nevada plan. That has been an exercise because it's, as I think part of this process at its very beginning is that it's just very complicated and it's not terribly transparent. We know we still have a few issues relative to that. That's leading to some excess revenue currently being included, reflected in the model version number 56 that we have today. But I have no doubt that in the next couple of days that's going to be resolved as well. So, Madam Chair, I'm happy to do whatever the Commission would like. I can do a walkthrough if that's appropriate. I can go into individual sections, or I just stand ready, we stand ready to model whatever it is that the Commission ultimately wants to see in terms of this blueprint and it being propped up based on the 2020 information. Madam Chair, I think you might still be on mute.
I am. I'm following Guy. Yes, I had to. Anyway, my inclination, unless I see a lot of no's, is to ask you to do sort of a walkthrough, maybe things that are different or highlight from the time we saw it in February. February seems a very long time ago, and although I still have the document, I'm not sure I spent much time with it in March. So if you could just do I know asking for a quick overview of something like, yes, exactly, Paul, might be challenging, but if you could kind of just do an overview of some of what you had just said there, the things that you've updated, and or if folks have specific questions, let's go ahead and do those. So let me check. Anybody have specific questions about the blueprint at this point?
Madam Chair, if Jeremy is going to do a walkthrough, yesterday we touched on, I believe we were talking about both the CWI section as well as the small school section, and I think one of the items that came up was whether or not there's a way to view the materiality of the topics that we're talking about. So as Jeremy's going through that, if he could maybe touch on, I don't know if he has that prepared or not, or if that's part of his modeling up to this point, but that might be helpful to see as well.
Okay, good.
Sure, I'm more than happy to.
Jeremy.
Sorry, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. Madam Chair, can I just ask a question? Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes, I am. I pulled yours up and then I can also see participants. So
sure.
Is everybody else able to see the screen, the presentation, the spreadsheet?
Until he actually
looks like
puts tiny numbers on there.
Well, how about if I make it a little bigger and try and do that, and we'll try to go from there. What I'll do, Madam Chair, unless you advise otherwise, is just sort of walk through some of the, like you said, the big components, and then maybe I can pause in a couple of places relative to what Mr. Hobbs asked for in terms of a couple of the nuances that the Commission was discussing, so I can show you some of the flexibility that's been built in around that. Hopefully that'll be pretty helpful in terms of doing that. These first blue schedules that you'll see as you go through it are really just administrative schedules, right? They include the table of contents that will allow you to jump to any particular element of the model. There's a new piece that you haven't seen before, and that's the update log. This is all of the changes that have been made to the model, and it'll include notes relative to things that remain open or outstanding, but it's just a series of each time James and I really are going back and forth on stuff, there's little pieces that we change or update. This doesn't mean that every time I change a spelling error or something like that, I put it into the model, but rather every time there's sort of a significant data update, we want to include that in here. And frankly, like Heidi said, we've been going back and forth a lot. And so making sure that NDE and our team are aligned relative to those changes are all included in that tab. The next set are the comp sets. And again, these are the elements that I think more than anybody else, and I don't mean to attribute them to anybody, but Member McIntosh sort of brought up in a lot of the questions. This includes every revenue source that has been included that's funding education today, that would be funding education under the pupil-centered funding plan, and it outlines each one of them. Member Johnson had asked previously for an analysis that includes the specific NRS references to each one of those. I showed that last time. It has also been updated in a couple of places just to make sure that it's there. It's kind of in one of the back schedules, so I won't spend a whole lot of time there. But I did want him to know that that's been included and continues to be updated. And again, thanks goes to James and his team for making sure that all that's pulled together. The other pieces that were not all filled out last time include the funding allocations, and again, some of these have excess revenue included in them. I'll make that a little larger, hopefully to make it a little easier to see, to include there. All of those have been updated. There is some excess revenue. There's some capital revenue that's currently included in here. So again, I don't want you to look at the base funding or the weighted funding to get a sense of what those totals are. These numbers are going to come down without a doubt. But for the time being, you can get kind of a sense of what's there. In addition to that, at the request of NDE, we modified it so that allocations outside of the pupil-centered funding plan are no longer specific to levels A, B, C, D, and E, but rather are now specific to federal funding, state matching funds, non-program funds, and other. It makes it a little bit cleaner on the one hand, but we lose some of the comparability on the other hand, but certainly cleaner and easier to walk through. There have also been a handful of footnotes that have been added. In addition to that, the comp set C, which includes the district by district comparisons, have now been expanded. You'll recall in the last model that we looked at, those were individual schedules. There was just one schedule that was the total. This is what that looks like under the data plan, then under the pupil-centered funding plan, and then the differential is beneath that. And again, these are all here, but again, they have some excess funds that are included relative to that. We've also expressed those schedules now, and I'm sorry, for each one of these, I'll scroll back up to the top. They include all for each level of funding for every school district and the state. All of the funding for each of those is included, with the total being identified in the bottom right-hand corner. Again, there's some excess revenue here. I don't want you to be overly concerned about that. I can tell you that when we pull it back out, the model is working perfectly. I just want to make sure that we ultimately align with what the department's estimates are in terms of under the current funding schedules that are there. The next two schedules, Comp Set C2 and Comp Set C3, just have the exact same schedule, but divided by the enrollment figures that were included. As Member Johnson indicated before, there were some questions in terms of the enrollment. We have received new enrollment information and integrated that in from the department. They sent some new information last week, earlier this week. We'll get that integrated in, but it's very de minimis in terms of the level of change relative to that. We have all of the data on a per pupil basis. Again, sorry, I'll make this a little larger, perhaps easier to see. And then we also have the information on a per pupil, but on a weighted per pupil basis. So in this case, instead of dividing special education students by all students within a district. It is divided by all special education students within each district so that everyone can analyze that and take a look at it as we continue to move forward. Under the blueprint itself, very little has changed here other than what we've talked about. And so I'll just spend a little bit of time going through the schedules as they exist, and then some of the new updates again that Member Hobbs talked about. Number one is really just the summary. It provides all the information. Again, I'll make that a little larger. Oh, not quite that large. I'll make it larger and perhaps a little bit easier to see. There we go. This includes information for each district, for the funding levels, with the base, the adjusted base that ultimately is adjusted for small schools, small districts, and the CWI, if any, and then the weighted student adjustments, the ancillary services, and the like overall. Very simple, very straightforward, very similar to the comp sets that you saw previously. All of the sources are now being allocated and now balanced overall. Sorry, I'll move that over and make it a little easier to see and also make it a little larger. All those currently balanced and are allocated out and reflect the most current information provided by NDE. The one that has caused, I think, the most sort of concern, or maybe the most just conversation, is this schedule that looks at the individual weights, right? So what the schedule shows is under the pupil-centered funding plan and then under the Nevada plan, how much is allocated on a per pupil basis in this total. Again, you'll notice that level C and D have a lot more money than was shown before, and that's because there's some capital that's being loaded into there. Again, once that comes back out, all of these numbers will be different overall, this will all end up rebalancing. Again, we are ultimately trying to balance the base to the base from the prior year. We are ultimately trying to balance the weights to the weights of the prior year with respecting some of the changes that were done in your conversations earlier today. Beyond that, there are a number of schedules that just simply balance all of that, distribute those funds out. That's what all of these are, ultimately getting to ones like the small school and the CWI factors. The CWI factor, let me just come back here. This schedule actually allocates the equity adjustments for all three factors. The small school factor is shown here. The small district factor is shown here based on the APA model. The small school one is shown here. Again, I'll make this a little larger to make it easier to see. The small school district, small schools is allocated here, and the wage cost differential is allocated here. If we go to the CWI as it currently exists, there have been a number of make this just a little bit larger. There have been a number of alternatives that have been provided. And I think this goes to Member Johnson's question yesterday. Can we just look at whatever scenario we want to look at? And the answer is yes. We've tried to add in the maximum amount of flexibility for the commission. So all those all the gray areas that you're seeing down in this area down here are all of the different alternatives that were included in the APA presentation from yesterday. And what we've done is load them up into a little drop-down menu. So if we, instead of wanting to use the hybrid EI using CWI all workers for wages and RPP goods for non-wages with a 1.04, and we instead wanted to use just the 2008 study results, we can just do that. It highlights that, loads it up, and then the entire model is then reallocated based on that change to the model. It's as simple as that, to being able to change anything that we want to look at. So I'll go back to what we had before. That's where we left off yesterday, and I want to make sure that that is as clean as possible. In addition to that, based on some of the questions that have been coming up, I also created a sub-schedule here down at the bottom. And that sub-schedule that's down here at the bottom provides, I'm going to make this just a little smaller, I hope you can still see it okay, provides the calculations under each alternative. So we can actually see for each district how much those individual changes make at the district level or at the total level. It's then calculated so, no matter what the model is ultimately using, the members can come in and kind of just see what those look like. I also did a quick calculation, and I can redo it. Oh, I guess I have it saved here. This is actually based on what, I forget who actually, member Casey asked the question, well, what if we just took the NCEI or the NCEI and didn't base it to 1, but rather just set it equal to the lowest value, made that equal to 1, and then had that be the value. There's a manual alternative that's here at the far right that just allows us to test anything else. So while you all were debating it yesterday, I just created that, where essentially Mineral County becomes 1 and everybody else gets based on their distance from Mineral County. You could think about this as the curved alternative. I mean, essentially, where whatever that lowest score is becomes the curve and everybody is set off of that. So that's all in there. If the commission ever wants to go through that, the goal is to make it as simple as possible for you to test those alternatives as the members determine they want to evaluate them. With regard to the small schools, Member Hobbs asked for this as well. I'll scroll up to the top and just show what's been included here. So the new recommendation that was provided was a pretty elegant solution around creating a tiering system for the small schools adjustment. So tier 1 is schools from 1 to 6 students, tier 2, 7 to 49, so forth and so on, all the way to tier 6 with 125 to 149 students in total. The model is now set up to make any adjustments that the commission would like to make relative to any of those tiers, whether that adjusts for the number of teachers or administrators or the salary schedules. It's all set up to be able to just allow that to flow all the way through the model. We could just make it 1 tier and go back to what it was like during the initial analysis and go from there. I know one of the questions that had come up pretty frequently was what schools should be included and what schools should not be included in terms of this calculation. There were like early childhood centers and things like that that had been previously included. I know Member Johnson had brought this up. And even in the most current estimates that we have relative to the schools, because we've now created, and I'm just going to scroll to the right here for a second, is an enrollment summary. And that enrollment summary has the enrollment for all students. It has the enrollment for special education students and ELL students and the like, but it's all based on district level calculations and then individual school calculations that sum back up to the district, and ultimately each individual charter school that's included here are all summarized in the model, all based on NDE's sort of master schedule of enrollment that is included here. That's this guy over here. And so whenever these change, that is then populating that small school analysis. And then to make sure that we are doing it right, we've just created a little toggle here, an on-off toggle. So if we determine, or the commission determines, some folks should rightly be in and some folks should rightly be out, those are all, we can just turn them on and off by making no, yes, and then they are included, or we can make no, yes, no, and then they're out. I don't know that it's perfect, but at least the ones that have come up thus far, we have included as part of that calculation. That flows all the way through the model. In addition to that, the next pieces that have been changed are really the hold harmless calculations. They're shown here, just a couple of sets of schedules here. One that is without the hold harmless or the freeze, the other one that is with the hold harmless and the freeze, and then ultimately this calculation on the far right, which again, I need to warn you, does not have accurate information because we're loading in too much money in the front end, but it looks at the net proceeds of mines and whether that's higher or lower than the distribution. It looks at whether the district is higher or lower than it was in the 2020 baseline period, and ultimately calculates out whether they are within or outside of the hold harmless and how that calculation, what that calculation needs to be included and ultimately balanced against the model itself. And so as that is ultimately determined by the commission, it should easily, and I think in this particular version of the model, in a more logical fashion, should allow someone to just see, oh, okay, this district had mining dollars, that was greater than the total, so that needs to be the allocation that was there. Or this district is in the hold harmless or outside of the hold harmless in a pretty simple and straightforward way overall. And again, I want to be clear, all of this is subject to review and interpretation by the Nevada Department of Education. And if they think that, you know, we're doing something wrong, as they've certainly indicated at times past, because we were wrong, they'll tell me to make whatever adjustments are necessary, and we'll do that as well. The schedules that come to on the far right-hand side are really just the feeder schedules. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I do want to just point them out. There's some calculations here, that's these black schedules, that make sure that we can summarize things by the total state funds. This we do in our office affectionately call these the Paul Johnson schedules, because they have all of the detail relative to each individual revenue source and where it's sourced to within the analysis. We then have the local funds, we then have the blueprint uses that are here. You will see that there's some discussion in terms of where the funds are coming from the state level historically, or whether they're coming from the local level historically. Some of that will need to be, to the extent that there's a difference there, this is where we can turn those off or turn them back on in some of that. I've already gone through the enrollment schedules. These are the state schedules, or what are referred to as the LO1 schedules in some places. Then you have all the district expenditures. Again, all the districts, this should be relatively familiar to each district. I'll just click on Clark County here for a minute. It's got all of the sources for Clark County. I'm sure that Member Gowdy will see that some of those seem a little bloated right now, and that's because they're including some capital. Please don't freak out on me. That's the reason why. We'll quickly get that done. There's also some excluded funds. These are funds that are outside of the pupil-centered funding plans, or are enumerated here so they're clear to everyone, and then the individual allocation for transportation and food service and special education and the like. And there's one of these for every single school district that's here, to make sure that those all sum to the values that are there. I would argue that the most significant difference that is in the current model are these purple, lavender, whatever color that is, schedules that are down here on the bottom. And this is really where the Nevada Department of Education went into excruciating detail. And I don't think I can understate enough the level of work that this was to go in and pull in each one of the grants, pull in each one of the funds by individual district level, which are all included in all of these schedules that are back here. 178, how is it allocated at the district level? That is all included and reflected all in these schedules that ultimately drive not the per pupil funding plan, but the comparisons that are included in the comp sets that are there. To the far right-hand side is a red tab, and everything to the right of here are all of the legacy schedules, which frankly I just haven't deleted because it'll make me sad to do that. At some point, Madam Chair, I'm going to need to delete all of those, and certainly when it's time to go from the blueprint to the actual model, and I know Heidi's been very clear about that, I want to do the same thing. When it's time to do that, all of those need to go away, but frankly, it's almost like a security blanket for me to know that we can go back and check against what was done during the legislative session to make sure we're not too far afield on any of that. So that is a general overview in terms of where we are. Again, I think as a team, we stand ready to answer any questions that the commission may ultimately have, or that the department may ultimately have. We'll continue to do some of the refinement as needed through all of this, but I think in terms of what Commissioner Mather talked about in terms of that standing up of a model to be able to test almost any scenario, I think it's pretty much ready to go.
Great. Great. Thank you. That was a great overview of something incredibly complex. And I am not the person to tell you when to delete, because I was actually an associate superintendent before I threw away my music lessons. As a music teacher, it took me about 15 years just to throw away the music lessons. So, Member Hobbs, question.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, incredible level of detail. It's good to know you're sentimental and don't want to let go of the old files too. I get that. It's good to know that we can perhaps, as we're having future discussions, see some of these changes real time. That's very comforting to know that capability exists. And I wanted to ask you just, and maybe this is taking a giant step back, Jeremy, but just so I can, sometimes I think I understand the way that all of the logic flows in this until we get into the weeds on some of our conversations. And then I'm wondering if I actually understood things the way I thought I did. So from a general methodology standpoint, in standing up the pupil-centered funding plan model, there is a requirement in 543, and 543 really is the guiding document in all of this, because it actually says what it says, despite what aspirations we may have for different parts of it. It already says what it says in black and white. So one of the elements of that is that the base amount has to be equal to or greater than the prior year. I'm saying things very simplistically here. And the same thing really with the weights, that the weights that we just had the conversation about are generally supposed to be equal to what they were in the prior year or greater. And just thinking that through as we were having that conversation, if the weights are set at a level that impacts the base, and the ability for the base to be at the level that it's supposed to be per 543, an amount equal to or greater than it was in the prior year, what kind of conflict could we potentially be creating there? And I would also imagine that if there was one, the way that 543 is drafted with respect to the base would take precedence. Does that make sense?
Member Hobbs, you had me all the way up until the last piece. I don't know. I have a hard time with the concept of, I have a hard time with the concept of what would take precedent over that, because I've sort of imagined as we're going through, and again, the commission or NDE may feel differently about it, but that both the base and the weights are sort of two parts of the same whole. And so neither one of them can take precedent. And I pointed this out last time, I'll just use it as the example, and that's why it looks kind of out of place here, because this schedule right here, PCFM4, it's just Pupil-Centered Funding Model 4, is the statewide allocation of funds. And while it seems like a remarkably silly and simple schedule, it is arguably the most important schedule that I have in terms of being able to make sure that the model itself balances. And again, please note, the numbers are too high here, so just take that for what it's worth. But what you'll note here is that through each tier or the waterfall, the total sum of the available resources must equal this number that's down here. The allocations that we're doing in the model cannot be any more than the resources that are allocated. And for the purposes of the base, it must equal the base under the Nevada plan in 2020. And under the weights must equal the weights under the Nevada plan in 2020. And so to your point, if we come in here and we go to the base and we just decide, you know what, we're going to change this base and we're going to, oops, let me make it bigger, not smaller. And what we're going to do here is we're going to decide that, no, we don't want the base to be $7,946 per student, which it never will be because there's too much money in the model. It's just balancing now, so it's a higher number. Please note that. And we decide we want that to be $6,000 a student. The entire model will recalculate. And you'll notice here that there's a balance cross-check. We now have $1 billion that is being allocated to the weights that cannot be allocated to the weights. And so the model forces itself to maintain those two parts, the base and the weights, to be equal with one another. Now, the second piece of what you talked about, I think, is also important, and that is when revenue comes through the top of the waterfall. If we come back here, and you'll notice that we're now out of balance. We now have values down here that we are not allowed to have because we are now funding the weights more than we did under 2020, right? But under the waterfall, then I think that there is precedent. And so I want to make sure that I'm clear about that. Under the waterfall, the way that I understand Senate Bill 543, again, subject to the interpretation of NDE and the commission, is that the base must be preserved. And that is, if $100 million comes into the top of that waterfall, then yes, the base will take precedence because it must increase by inflation and enrollment first before additional funds flow down into the other elements of the waterfall, right? And that is to make sure that we are not funding the base at the expense of the weights or the weights at the expense of the base. And so from that perspective, there absolutely is a precedent in terms of the waterfall. And again, I'm just going to go back in here for purposes of our conversation and reset this back to what it was before, so then we come back in here, we are now back in balance. And so to your point, if I change the weights, I get out of balance with the base. If I change the base, I get out of balance with the weights. And the model is set up to keep those two in line as much as possible, and essentially trying to balance to zero.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Jeremy, Mr. Aguero? Oh, Mark Mathers?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, sir.
So it looks to me, we had that conversation about the starting point and how the current effective weight, I'm using that old terminology, was calculated. But if I go to the tab Blueprint Uses Summary -Local, it looks to me like you are including what districts have chosen to allocate to different weights as in your starting point, in your current effective weight calculation.
I just want to make sure that I'm clear. Sorry, Jeremy Aguero for the record. I think you're looking at this schedule that I'm referencing. This is Blueprint Uses Summary. Yeah. And I think we are on the same page. These are the district allocations that I'm highlighting here, right? So for special education, right now, what the model has in it is roughly $580 million that is going to special education. Those dollars include $213 million allocated from what have been historical state sources and $366 million which have been discretionary expenditures from districts almost exclusively shifted from their general funds into a special education fund. And that is what is currently being modeled in the blueprint. Now, what I understood the conversation to be earlier was that what the commission wants to see is an alternative that essentially sets these equal to zero. And honestly, I had not thought about that before, Mark, so I haven't done that yet. I can't just do it on the fly. But by the time you ask me next time, I'll be able to turn that on and off so that you can do it. But what we'll do is that those dollars will no longer be part of that calculation. The weights will be determined by these allocations over here, and then the balance of that will be shifted back up into base funding, and then you can turn that on and off. Just a feature, frankly, I'd never thought of before, and so I don't have built in. You give me a day, I'll be able to do it. You do it it's a little bit harder to do one like that on the fly.
No, I totally understand. I just wanted to confirm that's how it looked. That's how it's set up now, which you just confirmed. So I'm good. And my understanding is you'll change it then, or at least allow us to look at it by zeroing out those dollar amounts in column E.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Paul, did you want to make an acceptance speech on having some of the spreadsheets named after you? Some of the tabs.
No, I'm good. I don't know if that was Jeremy recognizing that was a pain in the neck or not.
Considering the source, I think it was a little bit an admiration of recognition of detail, right? Any other questions about this particular presentation? I'm going to go back and not for this spreadsheet, but I want to go back, Jeremy, and play around with that way that you change the numbers for everything. So I'm assuming that's in data validation. So I'm going to go and play on a separate spreadsheet under separate things to see if I can actually replicate that action. So I may email you separately on a how to in Excel email, but it has nothing to do with this. Just I'm a fan of Excel and making it do things for me rather than having to think about how to do it myself.
Sure. Whatever you need, you let me know.
Thanks. At any rate, any other questions germane to actually the Pupil Center funding plan and updates on the blueprint? Okay, thank you, Jeremy, very much. As always, always enlightening and interesting to be able to see how all of this plays out at the detailed level. With that, we already had, I'm moving to number 6. Heidi outlined future agenda items for May, June, July, and I actually think there were enough there to carry us through August with some of the updates and conversations specifically with WestEd. Is there any other comments or conversations about future agenda items? Any requests, discussion? Okay, hearing none. That's always good news. Jessica, I think we are up to public comment number 2. In that case, do we have any?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do not see that I have received any public comment for number 2 at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. In that case, I just want to say excellent meeting, at least from my standpoint, both yesterday and today. I think we narrowed our focus and our conversations, made a lot of good decisions, and hopefully we helped Nevada Department of Ed and APA and Applied Analysis move forward in their thinking for the next steps. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Look forward to seeing you in May, and we might actually be back to face-to-face, or at least we now know how this works if we need to do it virtually again. So have a great weekend. Take care. And unless there are any other comments, we are done.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, now we all know, and I'm going to upload this and put it on my Facebook, and you'll be able to see it in its entirety, at least from what I caught. I think there was 1 minute in there where I wasn't recording, but that's okay. We're basically following the agenda, and I will share that too. So stop the record. Remember to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Facebook. Darlene Anderson. Here we go.